Hey friends, welcome back. If you are watching this right now, curled up somewhere comfortable, maybe with the lights already dimmed and a blanket pulled just a little tighter, I am really glad you are here tonight. Before we begin, let me just say something. I put a lot of heart into every story I bring to you. So, if tonight feels like something you want to carry with you, maybe hit like, drop a comment, or share it with someone who loves a good bedtime story. And if you are new here, the subscribe button is right there waiting for you. No pressure. Only do it if something here truly earns it. Now go ahead and dim those lights just a little more. Let the quiet settle around you. And let me take you somewhere you've never been before. Close your eyes for just a moment and picture this. It is the middle of the night, not late evening, the actual deep, cold, ink black middle of the night. The kind of darkness where you cannot see your own hand in front of your face. And somewhere out there, miles from the nearest town, a woman is already awake. She's been awake for an hour. She's wrapping dried fish in cloth, tucking eggs carefully into a basket lined with straw, pulling her shawl tighter across her shoulders. Outside her window, there is no light, no lamppost, no phone screen, no gentle blue glow of anything, just stars, just wind, just the sound of her own breath and the distant shuffle of her neighbor doing the exact same thing. She is going to the market today. And here's the thing that might surprise you. Here is what nobody tells you when they imagine a medieval marketplace with its colors and its noise and its drama. All of that magic, all of that noise and laughter and bargaining and chaos that will fill the square in just a few hours. It did not just appear. It was built quietly in the dark by people who had already been walking for 2 hours before the rest of the world even thought about opening its eyes. That is where our story begins tonight. Not in the middle of the market day, not in the shouting and the spectacle, but here in the dark, in the cold, in the invisible hours that made everything else possible. Let us set the scene properly, because the world we are stepping into tonight is one that deserves to be understood. We are somewhere in medieval England. Let us say the 14th century, a time when the towns were growing, when coins were beginning to replace bartering, when the great cathedrals were still being built, and the roads were little more than mud tracks carved by cartwheels and footsteps. This is not the fairy tale version of the Middle Ages with gleaming knights and elegant feasts. This is the real version. The one where most people lived in small villages, where the rhythm of life was set by seasons and church bells, and where the weekly market was the single most important event of the entire week. Historians who have studied this period carefully have found something fascinating. On average, most people in England during the 14th century lived just a little over 4 miles from their nearest market town. For miles. That sounds like nothing to us today. We drive 4 miles to get a cup of coffee. We walk 4 miles for exercise on a lazy Sunday afternoon. But try to imagine walking 4 miles in the dark and the cold on an unpaved track, carrying a basket of eggs on one arm and a bundle of dried herbs on the other, wearing leather shoes that have been resoled so many times they barely hold their shape. That is a different kind of 4 miles entirely. And those were the people who lived close. Some sellers came from much farther away. Merchants who dealt in heavier goods, wool, grain, livestock, sometimes began their journey the evening before camping along the road or sleeping in their carts, arriving at the edge of town before the gates even opened. The gates, yes, medieval market towns had gates, and those gates mattered enormously. Because here is something most people do not realize about the medieval market. It did not just begin whenever people showed up. It began at a very precise, very deliberate, very regulated moment. The church bell, that is what started everything. Every single market in medieval England and across most of Europe was governed by something that historians sometimes call the market piece. The idea was simple but powerful. When that bell rang out from the church tower, usually somewhere between 6 o'clock and 8 o'clock in the morning, depending on the town trade, was officially open, the market was in the language of the time in session. And until that bell rang, you were not allowed to sell anything. Not one apple, not 1 yard of cloth, not a single egg. Now, you might be thinking, well, who is going to stop you? Who's actually watching at 5 in the morning in a muddy market square in medieval England? The answer, my friends, is someone was absolutely watching. Towns had market officials. Some were called catchfulls, which is one of the greatest job titles in the history of human civilization. Their whole purpose was to patrol the market, look out for anyone breaking the rules, and collect fines from those who did. And the rules were serious. Selling before the bell was a punishable offense. Buying goods on the road before sellers even reached the market, also punishable. There was a practice called forestalling, which meant intercepting merchants on their way to market and buying their goods in advance before they could be offered fairly to the public. Forestalling was genuinely illegal. There are historical court records from the 13th and 14th centuries showing people being fined repeatedly for it. Why so strict? Because the whole point of the market system, the thing that made it work, the thing that gave ordinary people a fair chance, was that everyone had to play by the same rules in the same place at the same time. The moment you allowed private deals to happen before the bell, the moment you let the wealthy merchants intercept goods before the farmers even arrived, the whole system collapsed into something much darker and less fair. And the people who ran these towns understood that they had skin in the game. Towns earned real money from their markets. Every stall paid rent. Every transaction could be taxed. Every out-of-town merchant paid an entry toll. If the market became a place where buyers felt cheated or where sellers felt unsafe, those buyers and sellers would simply go somewhere else. And in a world where the next town with a market was only a few miles away and probably held their market on a different day of the week, which was not a coincidence, by the way, that was deliberate planning to avoid competition. You could lose your entire market economy practically overnight. So, yes, someone was watching at 5 in the morning. You better believe it. Now, let us go back to our woman in the dark. Her name, let us say, is Agnes. That was an incredibly common name in medieval England. If you were a woman in the 14th century, there was a very real chance your name was Agnes or Joan or Alice. Let us call her Agnes. Agnes lives in a small village, a cluster of maybe 20 or 30 families a few miles outside a market town. She does not own land. Her husband is a craftsman, a leather worker perhaps. But Agnes has her own small enterprise. She keeps chickens. She grows herbs in a kitchen garden. She collects honey from 2 hives. And every market day, which comes once a week in her town, she loads up her basket and makes the walk. She's been doing this for years. She knows the road, so well she could walk it blindfolded. And on some winter mornings in the pitch dark with only a small rushlight for company, she practically does. She knows exactly which stretch of road turns to mud after rain. She knows the stone bridge over the stream where her feet will get wet no matter how carefully she steps. She knows which field just outside town has a dog that barks at strangers. By the time Agnes arrives at the edge of town, the sky is beginning to lighten. Not sunrise yet, just that soft gray suggestion of dawn that makes shapes visible without making them colorful. And already around her, she can hear the market waking up. Cartwheels on cobblestone. The low, heavy breathing of oxen. The distant voices of men unloading sacks of grain. The sharp metallic clang of someone setting up a metal frame for a stall. And the smell. Here is where we need to pause, because the smell of a medieval market at dawn is something that no modern farmer's market on a sunny Saturday morning can prepare you for. This is not the polite, pleasant scent of fresh bread and lavender sachets. This is something far more alive. The warm, steaming smell of livestock cattle. Sheep, pigs, all waiting in temporary pens at the edge of the square. The sharp, oily smell of tallow candles burning in the butcher's area. The deep, earthy smell of grain and wet hay. And underneath all of it, because we are talking about a medieval town with no sewage system and open drainage channels running down the sides of the streets, something a little less poetic. Something that Agnes, like everyone around her, barely noticed anymore because it was simply the smell of the world she lived in. She had been breathing it her whole life. The stalls themselves were already going up. And here is something that surprises people when they learn it. Medieval market stalls were not always temporary pop-up structures. Many of them were semi-permanent. Some merchants had the same spot, the same wooden frame, the same physical location in the market square week after week, year after year. The frames were often stored nearby overnight and assembled quickly in the early morning. Others were genuinely permanent little wooden structures with enclosed tops, almost like tiny shops built right into the perimeter of the market square, where a merchant could lock up his goods and come back the following week to find them still there. The arrangement of those stalls was not random. It was structured and deliberate in ways that we'll explore much more deeply as our story continues. But for now, just picture it taking shape in the early morning light. A small city within the city built from wood and canvas and voices and breath, emerging from nothing in the space of an hour or two, ready to become the living, roaring, glorious, chaotic heart of an entire community. And at the center of all of it, there was always the church. Not just as a building, as a clock, as a referee, as the final authority over when this whole beautiful mess was allowed to begin. Agnes finds her usual spot. Not the best spot in the market. Those are reserved for merchants with more power, more money, more status. But she knows her corner. She spreads a cloth across the wooden board that serves as her table. She arranges the eggs carefully the way she always does in small groups that look abundant without being careless. She unpacks her dried herbs and hangs them from the little hook she has hammered into the wooden post beside her spot. She sets out her honey in a clay pot with a rag tied over the top. She is ready. Around her, dozens of other people are doing exactly the same thing. Some are nervous new sellers trying this for the first time, hoping the prices will hold and the crowds will come. Some are old hands at this relaxed and unhurried, greeting their neighbors like old friends, because these are old friends, people they have stood next to in this square every single week for 10, 15, 20 years. The sky is pink now, pale pink, the color of the inside of a seashell along the edge of the world. And then the bell rings, a single clear resonant ring from the church tower above the square. Then another, then the full rolling peal of the market opening. You can hear it in every corner of the town, echoing off the stone walls, rolling out along the roads to the fields beyond, carrying the message for miles in every direction. The market is open. The gates of the town swing wide. The people who've been waiting, and there have been people waiting. There are always people waiting flood and farmers from outlying villages. Townspeople who need food for the week. Craftsmen looking for materials. Children sent by their mothers with a few coins and a very specific list. The whole noisy, breathing, living organism of the medieval marketplace shudders and comes to life. Agnes takes a breath, looks at her eggs, looks at the crowd beginning to push and flow between the stalls. Somewhere across the square, someone is already arguing loudly about the price of something. A dog is barking. A child is crying. A man is laughing at something so hard he is bent double. This is it. This is what she walked 4 miles in the dark for, and it is only the beginning. Because here is what I want you to understand. As you settle in tonight, as the quiet wraps around you, and the story begins to pull you deeper, the medieval market was not just a place to buy and sell things. It was the most complex, the most layered, the most human institution of its age. It had laws and power and corruption and beauty and tragedy all packed into the same muddy square. Every stall had a story. Every coin changed hands carrying the weight of someone's survival. And we're just getting started. In a few moments, we're going to look at the invisible document that made every single market legal. The market charter, the royal permission that turned a field into a marketplace, and the fierce, sometimes violent competition between towns to own one. You might be surprised how much that piece of parchment changed the lives of ordinary people. And you might be even more surprised to discover who really controlled it all. Stay with me. The market is just opening. There is so much more to see. Something quietly remarkable sits at the heart of every medieval market. Not the noise, not the color, not the smell, but a single piece of parchment. Animal skin scraped thin and smooth, covered in careful Latin handwriting stamped with a wax seal. A document so powerful that without it, every stall in that market square was technically illegal. Every sale a criminal act. Every coin exchange could be seized. We are talking about the market charter. And if you think the story of a piece of paper could not possibly be interesting, hold that thought. Because the things people did to get one, protect one, or destroy someone else's, honestly, it reads more like a rivalry between rival restaurants in a cutthroat city than anything you would expect from the Middle Ages. Let me explain how this whole thing worked, because it is one of those systems that seems simple on the surface and turns out to be extraordinarily clever underneath. From around the 12th century onward, no town in England and across most of Western Europe could legally hold a regular market without permission from the king. That permission came in the form of a royal charter, a physical document drawn up in the royal chancery listing the specific terms of the grant, what days the market could be held, what goods could be traded, whether a fair or a larger seasonal event was also permitted, and crucially the name of the person or institution to whom this privilege was being granted. Now, here is the part that I find genuinely fascinating. The king did not give these charters away out of generosity. He sold them. Towns and lords paid real money, sometimes very substantial sums, to secure the right to hold a market. And in exchange, they received something extraordinarily valuable: exclusivity. When a chartered market was granted for specific market days, a nearby rival market could not legally open on those same days. Read that again slowly because it matters. If your town held a charter for Thursday market days, no other town within a certain distance could hold its market on Thursday. This was not a suggestion. It was legally enforceable, and it meant that the moment you had a charter, you had a monopoly on commerce in your area, at least for that day of the week. Think about what that meant for the towns that had charters and what it meant for the towns that did not. There is something I want to pause on here because it connects to a question that I think matters beyond just medieval history. Have you ever wondered why some small towns thrive while others just a few miles away slowly fade into nothing? Why some places become centers of commerce and life while neighboring villages stay quiet and forgotten? In the medieval world, the answer was often this: one town had a charter and the other did not. A chartered market attracted traders, which attracted customers, which brought in tolls and taxes, which funded better roads, better infrastructure, better amenities, which attracted more traders. It was a wheel that once set spinning was very hard to stop. Towns that secured charters early and held on to them built advantages that compounded over generations. Towns that missed out found themselves permanently in the shadow of their neighbors. The records preserved in England's National Archives still hold the charter rolls from the years 1199 onward, the painstaking lists of every grant the king made. Historians studying these documents have found that the peak years for charter grants in England were roughly between 1240 and 1270. During those 3 decades, lords and towns were petitioning the king at a remarkable rate. All of them understanding that this was a race, and that finishing second meant finishing nowhere. One of my favorite small stories within this big story comes from a charter dated February 9th, 1267. The king at that time was Henry III, a monarch who granted a very large number of market charters during his reign. And on that particular February day, he granted a charter to a woman named Matilda Passalou. The document, which still exists and can be consulted in the National Archives in London, granted Matilda the right to hold a weekly market and an annual fair on her manor in Suffolk. A woman in the 13th century holding a royal market charter in her own name. I think about Matilda sometimes, what it would have taken for her to secure that document, the petitioning, the negotiation, the money exchanged, the Latin letters she would have had someone write on her behalf, and then the charter arriving, this stiff formal piece of parchment with the king's wax seal, smelling faintly of the Shankery scribe's candles and what she did with it. She almost certainly had it stored somewhere safe, possibly in a chest, possibly shown to her neighbors as proof that she had something nobody could easily take away. From her, a royal charter was not just a permission slip, it was power written down and sealed. Now, acquiring the charter was only the beginning of the story. Keeping it and keeping other people from undercutting it was where things got genuinely interesting. The rules around competing markets were enforced through legal proceedings, petitions, and sometimes through rather more direct means. When a new market grant threatened an existing one, the affected lord or town had the right to appear before the king's court and argue that the new market would cause damage to their own. These proceedings were called quo warranto, Latin for by what warrant, and they were essentially the medieval equivalent of a lawsuit. Lords waived their charter rolls, made arguments about distances and market days, and tried to convince the court that the new grant was harmful and should be revoked. Some of these disputes went on for years. Some turned personal in ways that courtroom language barely conceals. There is something almost funny about reading 800-year-old legal documents and recognizing the exact same energy of a very territorial business owner writing an angry letter to the planning department about a competitor moving in next door. The specifics are medieval. The human feeling underneath is completely recognizable. And here is a detail that I think really captures what was at stake. Towns that held market charters were required to invest in them. The charter was not a passive document. It came with obligations. You had to actually run the market. You had to maintain the space, appoint officials to regulate trading, ensure that weights and measures were being checked, and collect the tolls that justified the whole arrangement. If you let the market fall into disorder, if traders stopped coming, if buyers felt they were being cheated, your charter meant nothing. Because no amount of royal permission could keep a market alive that nobody wanted to attend. This is why, as the number of charters across England grew through the 13th century, the competition between market towns began to evolve in a particular direction. It was not enough anymore to simply have a charter. You had to be better. You had to give traders reasons to choose your market over the one in the next town. And so towns started developing something like a reputation economy. Specific places became known for specific things, and buyers would travel specifically because of what they knew they would find there. London's Blackwell Hall became one of the premier centers for cloth trading in the country. Bristol built a reputation around a particular deep red dyed fabric that came to be known as Bristol Red. The village of Worstead in Norfolk, a tiny place, the sort of place you could walk through without noticing, gave its name to an entire category of yarn that we still use today. Centuries later, every time someone refers to worsted wool, even the word, that everyday textile word in the English language, is a monument to one small medieval market town that did something well enough and for long enough that the world never forgot it. That is the kind of legacy a market charter could build. Not just commerce, identity, language, history embedded in the fabric of everyday life, quite literally. But there is another side to this story, and it is one that the formal documents tend to gloss over because the formal documents were written by and for the people who benefited. Not everyone who wanted a charter could get one. The cost alone put it beyond the reach of most ordinary communities. And even if a village somehow scraped together the funds and secured the grant, what happened when a powerful lord nearby decided he did not like the competition? The legal system was real, but it was also slow, expensive, and tilted significantly toward those with money and connections. Small grants could be challenged, undermined, or simply ignored by powerful neighbors who knew that the people holding the charter lacked the resources to fight back effectively. There is a reason that the towns which kept thriving across the medieval period tended to be the ones with powerful patrons, a lord, a bishop, a monastery with significant land holdings, and the political weight to protect their charter against rivals. The document gave you rights. The patron gave you the power to enforce them.
And here's a thought I keep coming back to.
There is something in that dynamic, the gap between having a legal right on paper and having the practical power to exercise it, that feels startlingly familiar. The form changes across centuries. The underlying pattern does not. By the end of the 13th century, England had an extraordinary web of chartered markets spreading across the countryside. Hundreds of towns, each holding their specific days, their specific goods, their specific agreements with the crown. The whole network had an internal logic. Markets staggered across the days of the week, so that a traveling trader could move from town to town in a circuit, selling here on Monday, there on Wednesday, somewhere else on Friday, resting on Sunday, as the church required, then beginning again. It was in its way a system of extraordinary sophistication, built from hundreds of individual deals, each one negotiated separately, but all of them fitting together into something that functioned almost like a design network, even though no single person had designed it. There is something almost beautiful about that order emerging from thousands of separate decisions, each made out of self-interest, each responding to local conditions, each contributing without knowing it, to a structure that held the entire commercial life of a country together. Agnes, our woman from the village, almost certainly never thought about her market in those terms. She thought about her eggs. She thought about the walk. She thought about whether the price of honey had shifted since last week, but she was part of something much larger than she knew, a system built on parchment and sealing wax and royal prerogative that had quietly organized the world she lived in from the ground up. And that world, once you stepped inside the market gates, had its own internal geography, its own rules, its own hierarchy written not in charter roles, but in the physical arrangement of every single stall, which is exactly where we are headed next, because the layout of a medieval market was not as random as it looked. In fact, it was one of the most deliberately organized spaces in the entire medieval world. And once you understand the logic behind where everyone was placed and why the most powerful vendors always ended up at the center, you will never look at a busy public space the same way again. Walk into any old English town today, and I mean a genuinely old one, the kind where the buildings lean slightly toward each other as if sharing a secret. And if you look at the street signs, something strange happens. You start to notice names that make no immediate sense. Bread Street, Milk Street, Honey Lane, Friday Street, the Shambles, Poultry. These are not poetic choices or modern branding. There's something far more interesting than that. They are the fossil record of a medieval market pressed into stone and preserved for 8 centuries because nobody ever quite got around to changing them. And once you understand what those names mean, once you understand the logic that placed the fishmongers here and the bakers there and the butchers somewhere else entirely, the layout of a medieval market stops looking like organized chaos and starts looking like something else altogether. Something that tells you everything about the society that created it. Let us start with the word. The word is cheap. Not cheap as in inexpensive, though that meaning did come later. In medieval English, cheap simply meant a market, a place of trade, a place of bargaining. The Old English word seep carried that meaning, and it lives on in dozens of English place names to this day. Cheapside in London, Chipping Norton, Chipping Camden, East Cheap, West Cheap. Every time you see that root cheap chipping chair, you're looking at a ghost of a medieval marketplace. A place where people once stood in the mud and haggled over the price of a cabbage. Cheapside in London was arguably the greatest of all medieval English markets. By the time it reached its height in the 13th and 14th centuries, it was not merely a street, but an entire commercial district. A living system so vast and so ordered that every single lane running off the main thoroughfare had its own specialized trade. And here is where it gets genuinely wonderful. Those street names told you exactly what to expect before you even turned the corner. If you wanted bread, you found Bread Street, which was already being called Bread Straight as early as 1180. If you wanted milk, you went to Milk Street. If you needed Timberwood Street, if your Catholic faith required fish on a Friday, as it did for every practicing Christian in England, you went to Friday Street, where the fishmongers gathered on that specific day of the week to serve their most religiously obligated customers. Honey Lane, Ironmonger Lane, Poultry. Each name a small, precise advertisement carved into the geography of the city itself. I find this quietly beautiful. Before printing, before signage in any modern sense, before literacy was widespread enough to make written directions useful, the city organized itself so that you could navigate by logic alone. You knew where to go because the world had been arranged to make sense. There is something almost tender in that a city trying to be legible to its own people. Now, here is where I want you to look a little deeper because the layout of these markets was not just practical. It was also a very clear, very deliberate expression of social hierarchy. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. Think about the market square as a kind of stage. Not every position on that stage carried equal weight. Some spots were inherently more valuable than others. The stalls nearest the main entrance, where every buyer flowing in from the gates would pass first. The positions with natural shelter from the arcaded buildings at the perimeter. The locations closest to the center of the square where traffic from all directions converged. Those spots did not go to the farmers. They did not go to the small-time peddlers carrying baskets of herbs. They went to the people with the most power, the most money, and the most organized political muscle. In almost every town across medieval England and France, the butchers occupied the premium positions. Not because butchery was considered a glamorous trade, it absolutely was not, but because butchers were organized into guilds of enormous strength and political influence. They had connections. They had leverage. They had the collective weight of an entire professional association behind every negotiation over stall placement. And their position was also deeply practical. Meat was the single most important commodity at most markets. The thing that drew the most buyers, generated the most revenue, and required the most oversight. You could not afford to tuck the butchers into a corner. Everyone needed to find them immediately. But here is the part that does not make it into the tidy history books. The butchers were powerful, yes, but they were also required in many towns to operate in the most intensely regulated and scrutinized conditions of anyone at the market. Because meat is dangerous, meat spoils. A dishonest butcher, and there were many dishonest butchers, as we will discover later in our story, could make a large part of the population seriously ill in a single day. So they were watched closely, taxed heavily, fined often, and in some towns by around 1300, required to do their actual slaughtering outside the city walls in designated areas called shambles. That word, the shambles. Every large town had one. The name has drifted in meaning over the centuries. Today we use it to describe any scene of complete disorder, which is perhaps not entirely inaccurate given its origins. In the Middle Ages, it referred specifically to the wooden frames, the shelved benches on which butchers displayed their cuts of meat. The shambles in York still exist.
Today, you can walk down it.
The buildings lean so close together overhead that in some spots you can nearly touch both sides with your arms outstretched. The street is so narrow that it feels like stepping inside something rather than moving through it. And if you look carefully at the ground floor windows, wider than usual, lower than usual, you're looking at the descendants of the medieval display benches where meat was laid out for buyers to examine. Standing there 800 years later, you can almost hear it. Now, a question worth sitting with for a moment. If you had lived in a medieval market town and someone offered you a stall position, any position anywhere in the square, where would you want to be? Most people say the center, and most people would be wrong. The center of a medieval market square was not the most desirable commercial position. It was often occupied by temporary stalls that could be cleared quickly, or by the market cross, or by the pillory, which we will come to in part 10 of our story, and which is a genuinely fascinating part of market life. I'm very much looking forward to telling you about the true premium positions where the arcaded ground floors of the permanent buildings ringing the perimeter of the square sheltered from rain. Solid structure behind you, lockable storage on the upper floors for your inventory, the ability to be present every single day, not just on market days if you ran a genuine shop rather than a weekly stall. And the buildings themselves encoded status in a way that is still physically visible in surviving medieval towns. Have you noticed when walking through a genuinely old market town how strangely narrow the buildings are? 3 stories tall, sometimes 4, but perhaps only 3 or 4 meters wide at street level. The reason is taxation. Ground floor frontage on a market square was taxed by width. The narrower your buildings faced to the street, the less you paid. So merchants built tall and narrow, maximizing vertical space while minimizing the tax surface. What looks like an architectural quirk is actually centuries of rational response to a fiscal system. Every building was an argument about money pressed into timber and stone. Away from the center, the geography of a medieval market told you exactly where you stood in the world. The luxury goods, the spices, the fine cloth, the goldsmith work clustered close to the main square near the wealthiest flow of traffic in positions rented at the highest prices. A little further out, the everyday necessities, grain-bred basic cloth pottery. Further still, the trades that nobody wanted as neighbors, the tanners, who used urine and dung in their leather-working process and created a smell that could stop a conversation at 30 paces. The dyers, whose vats of boiling color ran into the street gutters in vivid toxic streams, the slaughterhouses. These trades were pushed toward the edges of town, toward the riverbanks, where the waste could flow away toward the gates where the smell would dissipate before reaching the square. Town authorities issued ordinances about this, actual written rules specifying where certain trades could and could not operate. By 1300, in many English towns, live animal slaughter within the market area was already restricted or forbidden. The messiness and the noise and the terror of livestock being killed in public right next to the bread stall and the honey cellar had become socially unacceptable. This is something I think is worth pausing on. Medieval people are often portrayed as having no concept of public health or civic order. And yet here they were in the 13th century zoning their commercial districts by type of trade, regulating where hazardous or unpleasant activities could occur. Thinking systematically about the relationship between commercial geography and the quality of life for the people who live nearby. It was not our system. It was not perfect, but it was not nothing either. There is one more element of the market's physical design that I want to bring into this, because it ties the whole picture together in a way that I find genuinely moving. And that is the market cross. In the center, or near the center of almost every medieval market square stood a stone cross. Not a church, not a building, just a cross, sometimes simple, sometimes elaborately carved, sometimes with a small roof over it, to provide shelter for merchants below. The market cross served several purposes at once. It marked the precise location of the market visible from a distance, telling travelers that trade happened here. It provided a gathering point, a fixed reference in a space that otherwise shifted and changed week to week. And it did something else, something that cuts right to the heart of what a medieval market meant to the people who used it. It asked for God's blessing on the trade that happened beneath it. This was not ceremonial decoration. In a world where the line between commerce and morality was drawn very differently than we draw it today, where usury, meaning the charging of interest on loans, was considered a genuine sin, where the idea of a just price was debated by theologians as seriously as any question of doctrine. The presence of a cross in the market square was a constant reminder. Every transaction that happened here was happening under an implicit obligation, not just to the law, not just to the charter, to something larger. In Cheapside, London, the Great Cheapside Cross stood at the heart of the market for centuries. It was gilded fresh for the coronation of every new monarch. Royal processions passed around it. It was the symbolic center of London's commercial life, the point at which the sacred and the mercantile met, and, at least in theory, kept each other honest. Whether it worked is, of course, another question entirely. And the answer to that question is something we're going to explore in great detail very soon. Because what was actually sold in the stalls surrounding that crossed the extraordinary range of goods that changed hands in a medieval market on any given week turns out to be one of the most startling, most surprising, most frankly jaw-dropping parts of this entire story. Stay with me. The market is fully open now. The crowds are thick. The noise is extraordinary. And we're about to walk right into it.
Right.
You have been patient, and now the market is fully alive around us. The bell has rung. The gates are open. The crowds are pressing in. So let us actually go shopping. And I want to be very clear about something before we start walking through these stalls together. If your mental image of a medieval market is something like a charming outdoor farmer's market, a little rustic, a little wholesome, fresh bread and cheerful vendors, maybe some folk music in the background, I need you to gently set that image aside. What was actually sold in a medieval marketplace was something far stranger, far more layered, and in at least a few cases genuinely jaw-dropping by any standard past or present. Let us begin with the thing everyone knows, and then immediately complicate it. The staples first, because even the ordinary goods carried a kind of weight we've lost touch with. Grain was the foundation of everything. Wheat, rye, barley, oats, and the grain market was often physically separate from the rest of the market precisely because of how much of it moved and how carefully it needed to be measured. 2 dozen eggs cost 1 penny in 14th century England. 2 chickens, also 1 penny. A goose in London ran to about 6p. This sounds trivially cheap until you know that an unskilled laborer earned around 2p a day on a good week. Every purchase was a calculation. Every penny spent on market food was a penny not spent on something else equally necessary. Salt deserves its own moment of attention because we take it so completely for granted that its medieval significance is almost impossible to feel. In the 14th century, salt was not a seasoning. It was survival technology. Without refrigeration, without canning, without any of the preservation methods we rely on. Today, salt was the only thing standing between a decent catch of fish in September and starvation in February. It preserved meat through the winter. It cured hides. It was used in schism, in medicine, in religious ritual. Towns that sat on salt deposits or near coastlines with salt pans held a form of strategic wealth that shaped the politics and economics of entire regions. When you see salt for sale in a medieval market, you are not looking at a condiment. You're looking at infrastructure. Now, let us move deeper into the market, past the grain sacks and the salt barrels and the baskets of eggs toward the stalls that made the market truly extraordinary. The spice traders. Even in a relatively modest market town, if the right merchants were there that week, you might find yourself looking at small wooden boxes and carefully sewn cloth bags containing things that had traveled. And I want you to sit with this, sometimes literally years to reach that stall. Pepper from the Malabar coast of India, cinnamon from Ceylon, cloves from the Molucca Islands, which Europeans of the time sometimes called the Spice Islands. So far away that most people who bought the cloves could not have pointed to those islands on a map, even if one had been available. Ginger from South Asia, nutmeg from the same archipelago as the cloves, was a journey of more than 6,000 miles by land and sea before it reached a market in England or France, and the prices reflected every mile of that journey. A skilled craftsman in 14th century England, a mason, or a carpenter earned roughly 2 shillings a week. A pound of cloves at that same time cost around 4 shillings, which means that buying a single pound of cloves would have cost a craftsman 2 full weeks of wages. A pound of saffron, the dried stigmas of a particular crocus flower, harvested by hand, 3 stigmas per flower. Roughly 150 flowers to produce a single gram, cost between 12 and 15 shillings per pound in the 14th century. That was the equivalent of 6 or 7 weeks of a craftsman's wages for pound one of a spice. So light it barely registers in your hand. Here is what always strikes me about those numbers. Saffron today is still one of the most expensive spices in the world. And yet most people who have encountered it have used it in a paella or a risotto and thought nothing of the cost. In the 14th century, a pinch of saffron in a wealthy man's dish was a statement of power, as deliberate and visible as wearing a diamond ring to a job interview. The spice did not just flavor the food. It announced that the person eating it could afford to. And here is something that genuinely surprised me when I first encountered it. We often hear that medieval people used spices to cover up the taste of rotting meat. That the lavish seasoning in wealthy kitchens was essentially a cover-up operation for food that had gone bad. I believed this for years. It is the kind of thing that gets repeated, so often it starts to feel like established fact, but historians who have studied medieval food culture carefully have largely dismantled this idea. Spices were extraordinarily expensive. You did not use an expensive thing to disguise a cheap problem. If your meat was rotten, you did not season it with 4 shillings worth of cloves. You threw it out and bought more meat, which was considerably cheaper. Wealthy medieval people used spices for exactly the same reason wealthy people today pay thousands of dollars for bottles of aged wine or tiny portions of truffled pasta. Because it was a performance, because it demonstrated that they had access to something most people could not imagine affording. The spice stall in the market was not selling a utility. It was selling status bottled in small cloth bags and carried on ships from the other side of the world. Now we need to talk about the other side of the market. The side that the polite history books sometimes gloss over, and that I find genuinely fascinating precisely because of how uncomfortable it makes modern sensibilities, because alongside the grain and the salt and the exotic spices, medieval markets sold things that we would find deeply strange today. Some were strange because they reflect a medical understanding so different from ours that it might as well be from another planet. Some were strange because they reveal how porous. The line between the sacred and the commercial was in medieval life, and some were strange because, honestly, they were just strange. Let us start with what the sellers themselves would have considered completely normal. Second-hand clothing. Not vintage, not curated, just clothing that had belonged to someone who no longer needed it, which in the Middle Ages frequently meant someone who had recently died. A good woolen tunic, even a used one, represented real value. Cloth was expensive and labor intensive to produce. Nothing was wasted. Clothing passed from owner to owner, was mended and patched until the mending itself wore out, and eventually found its way to the market to begin a new life on someone else's back. There were dealers who specialized in this, people who knew the value of a particular weave or cut and could price a dead stranger's garments with professional efficiency. We might find that unsettling. They found it practical. Medicinal ingredients of every description, and here is where it gets genuinely strange. Leeches sold alive in containers for the medical practice of bloodletting that dominated European medicine well into the modern era. Dried plants and roots with properties that range from genuinely useful to dangerously toxic to completely ineffective depending on who is selling them and what they actually knew about bot. Animal parts dried, powdered, preserved, used in remedies that had been passed down through generations of practitioners. Powdered pearls, ground gemstones. There were physicians who prescribed gold dust as a treatment for certain ailments on the theory that something so valuable must confer its value on the person consuming it. The market stall that sold medicinal goods was not distinguishable in any obvious way from one that sold food. This matters more than it might seem. There was no regulation of medical knowledge. No licensing, no way for an ordinary buyer to distinguish between a herbalist who genuinely understood plant medicine and a charlatan who was making it up as they went. You walked up to the stall. You described your symptoms. You paid for what they offered, and you hoped. But I have saved the most remarkable category for last because it requires a moment of genuine imaginative effort to understand. Not judgment understanding. Relics, bones, fragments, small objects, all claim to be connected to saints, martyrs, holy figures. Pieces of the true cross, hair of the Virgin Mary, the tooth of a particular apostle, a vial of water from the River Jordan, a thread from the cloak of a well-regarded bishop who had died 200 years earlier. These things were not just religious curiosities. They were in the medieval understanding of the world objects of genuine power. To own a relic was to have access through that physical object to the spiritual influence of the holy person it was connected to. Relics could heal the sick. They could protect a household. They could, if prayers directed through them were answered, change the course of a person's life. And so they were bought and sold. Geoffrey Chaucer, who was walking through markets like the ones we've been describing when he was writing his Canterbury Tales in the late 14th century, gave us one of literature's most vivid portraits of this trade in his pardoner character. The pardoner is a man who travels from town to town and market to market, selling indulgences and relics. Claiming divine authority for documents, he is almost certainly forged and sacred objects that are, as Chaucer tells us, with barely concealed contempt, pig bones. Pig bones wrapped in cloth and presented as the finger of a saint. The market in relics was so extensive and so thoroughly infiltrated by forgeries that the church itself repeatedly tried to bring it under control and repeatedly failed. A church in Geneva proudly displayed what it believed to be the brain of St. Peter until the object was accidentally moved one day and discovered to be a piece of pumice. The town of Bari in southern Italy sent a team to the city of Myra specifically to steal the bones of St. Nicola, the historical figure who would later become Santa Claus, and bring them back. The theft was successful. The town celebrated. Nobody apparently questioned whether stealing a saint's bones was itself perhaps morally complicated. There were so many fragments claimed to be from the true cross scattered across Europe's churches and markets that a French scholar centuries later calculated that if they were all genuine, the cross would have had to have been roughly the size of a small warship. And yet I want to be careful here because the easiest and most modern response to this is to laugh. And I think that would be a mistake. The people buying these things were not stupid. They lived in a world where the boundary between the physical and the spiritual was understood to be thin and permeable in ways we no longer believe. Where God's intervention in daily events was not a metaphor but a literal expectation. Where the death of an infant, the destruction of a harvest, the sudden onset of illness could only be explained through frameworks we no longer use. Within that world, within that understanding of how reality worked, reaching for a relic in a moment of desperation was not so different from reaching for a prescription. The mechanism was different. The hope was the same. Now, let us pull back for a moment and look at all of it together. The grain and the salt and the spices and the relics and the second-hand tunics and the medicinal leeches, and ask a simple question. What does this market taken as a whole actually tell us about the people who moved through it? It tells us they were resourceful. In a world without department stores or supply chains or any guarantee of what would be available from week to week, people developed an extraordinary ability to find repurpose, preserve trade, and assess the value of an enormous range of goods. It tells us they were discerning. The historical record shows that medieval consumers were genuinely careful. Shoppers comparing quality and price across different vendors, making decisions based on reputation and experience. And it tells us they were human in all the ways humans have always been willing to believe in things that offered comfort susceptible to those who would exploit that willingness, and also capable of the sharp, practical, entirely unsentimental calculation of someone who knows what 2 shillings buys and what it does not. But here is the question I keep coming back to, the one that seems to me the most interesting one in this whole story. The goods tell us what people had and what people wanted. They do not yet tell us who is actually standing behind those stools making these exchanges happen. Because the vendors of the medieval market, the people who showed up every week, who knew their customers, who lived or failed by the quality and fairness of what they offered, were a far more complicated, far more surprising group than the history books typically suggest. And that is exactly who we are going to meet next. Pull back from the stalls for a moment. Forget the goods. Forget the prices and the smells and the complicated geometry of the market square. Instead, look at the faces. Because the most extraordinary thing about a medieval market, the thing that I think gets overlooked in almost every account of it, is the sheer variety of people standing behind those stalls. The vendors of the medieval marketplace were not a single type. They were not a uniform class of traders in identical circumstances, all playing the same game by the same rules. They were in fact one of the most diverse and stratified groups of people you could find anywhere in medieval society. And the differences between them, who was allowed to trade, how, under what conditions, in what categories of goods, with what protections, and with what vulnerabilities, reveals something essential about how that society actually functioned beneath the surface of the official story. Let us start with who you might actually have been had you found yourself standing at a medieval market stall. The most numerous vendors, the ones who formed the backbone of the food market in particular, were women. Not a small minority of women in many documented markets. Women were the majority of food stall holders. They sold eggs, dairy, poultry, vegetables, herbs, and honey. They sold preserved foods. And the most significant among them in terms of cultural and economic impact were the alewives. The word alewife is recorded in England from the late 14th century to describe a woman who brewed and sold ale commercially, but the practice it described was far older. Ale was not a luxury in medieval England. It was a staple. It was the safest liquid most people drank in a world without reliable clean water, because the brewing process, the boiling, the fermentation killed the things that would otherwise have made you seriously ill. Children drank it in diluted form. Laborers carried it in the fields. It was as fundamental to daily survival as bread, and for most of the medieval period, women made it. The record suggests that brewing was understood culturally and practically as women's work. It grew naturally out of household management. Wives brewed for their families, and the step from brewing for family consumption to selling the surplus to neighbors was a small one. An alewife from Oxford named Maud London appears in 14th century records as a respected and commercially active brewer. She was not unusual. She was representative of hundreds of women like her across England and France who had built real independent commercial lives out of a trade that was entirely their own. Here's the thing that I find genuinely poignant about the alewife story, though. It had an ending, and the ending arrived not because these women failed at their trade, but because their trade succeeded. As ale production became more profitable, men organized into guilds backed by capital with legal advantages that married women under coverture law simply could not access moved in and took it over. By the 16th century, the large-scale professional brewery was predominantly male. The alewife did not disappear overnight. She was slowly, systematically edged out of a trade she had essentially invented by an economic and legal system that was better designed to consolidate wealth in male hands. If you want a clean, uncomplicated example of how gender interacted with economics in the medieval world, there it is. But the wives were not the only women whose market lives were complicated by the world they operated in. Let me tell you about the hewers. The word huster today carries connotations we would probably prefer to avoid: a pushy salesperson, someone not entirely trustworthy. In the Middle Ages, it describes something more precise and considerably more neutral. A woman usually who bought goods from producers and then resold them in smaller quantities at slightly higher price, often by carrying them through the streets in a basket rather than operating from a fixed stall. Hucksters occupied an awkward space in the market hierarchy. They were necessary. They bridged the gap between bulk producers who could not afford to stand in the market all day and individual customers who needed small quantities of specific things. But they were also resented because they were making a profit on goods they had not produced themselves. And this kind of intermediary profit made the guardians of market morality deeply uneasy. The moral theology of the period insisted on the just price, the idea that goods should be sold for what they were genuinely worth, not inflated by middlemen's margins. Hustlers were perpetually suspected of violating this principle. And yet there they were week after week, because without them the market functioned less efficiently for everyone. The tension between ideological purity and practical necessity is, I suppose, not an exclusively medieval problem. There were also the regraders, a slightly more formal version of the same role people who bought goods in the market and then resold them often on the same day. This was technically illegal under the foreling and redrating laws we touched on in part 1 of our story, but it being pushed out of their own industry? Hustlers being fined for the profitable crime of middlemanship. Italian merchants living in London as financial aristocracy. German traders fortified behind walls against popular resentment, and a Jewish community that was first exploited and then expelled. It tells us that the medieval market, for all its color and noise and extraordinary range of goods, was not a level playing field. It never was. Every vendor standing behind a stall had a different relationship with the law, with the guilds, with the social structures that determined who could do what and under what conditions. And the closer you look at those differences at who was protected and who was not, who held privilege and who paid for it, the more the market reveals itself as something beyond commerce. It was, as I keep coming back to, a mirror, and what it reflected was the full complexity of the society that created it: ambitious, creative, unjust, resilient, and utterly, irreducibly human. But here is what I have been holding back. The part of the market story that involves real theater, real drama, and real consequences happening right in the middle of the crowd. Because once the goods were laid out and the buyers arrived and the selling began, another set of actors stepped onto this stage. The people who had figured out how to exploit the system, and the people whose job it was to catch them. The art of the deal in a medieval market was not what you might expect, and neither were the consequences of getting it wrong. Here is something that might genuinely surprise you, given everything we tend to assume about the rough and tumble chaos of a medieval marketplace. In the food stalls, the bread, the grain, the ale haggling was actually illegal, not discouraged, not frowned upon, illegal, punishable by fine. I find this one of the most counterintuitive facts about medieval commerce, and it took me a while to fully understand the reasoning behind it. We associate the market with bargaining almost by instinct. You walk up, you make an offer, they counter, you settle somewhere in the middle. That is what markets do, right? But medieval authorities saw food bargaining very differently, and their reasoning was rooted in something deeper than mere economics. It starts with an idea that dominated medieval thinking about trade for centuries. Theologians, lawyers, and civic authorities all wrestled with what they called the just price Latin priam, just a concept that sounds simple until you try to pin it down. The basic idea was that every good had an objectively fair value, and that buying or selling at any price wildly different from that value was a moral problem. Not just a financial one, a moral one. You were not simply taking advantage of a situation. You were, in the theological framing of the time, committing a kind of injustice against another person. The greatest thinkers of the age debated exactly what made a price just. Was it the cost of production, the standard market rate that everyone in town agreed on, the price that allowed both buyer and seller a fair and modest living? The answers varied, but the underlying concern was consistent. Commerce was not morally neutral. Every transaction carried ethical weight. The market operated under an implicit obligation to fairness that went beyond mere contract law. This sounds almost quaint from our vantage point from inside an economic system where the price of something is simply whatever someone will pay for it. But follow the logic forward. And it actually makes a strange kind of sense in a world without price transparency, without standardization, without any of the mechanisms we rely on to know whether we are paying a fair amount for something. The just price framework was a way of building trust into a system that desperately needed it. If you knew the baker charged everybody the same for the same loaf, you could walk up to his stall with confidence. The moment bargaining entered the picture, that confidence evaporated. Now you had to wonder, am I getting the same deal as everyone else? Is this the real price, or is he starting high because he thinks I look gullible? Remove the haggling, and you remove a whole category of anxiety from the marketplace. The just price was not just idealism. It was a practical technology of trust. Now, the most important mechanism through which this principle was actually enforced, and I think this is one of the most fascinating administrative innovations of the medieval period, was the assays of bread and ale. The word assays simply means a standard or a regulation, and the assays of bread and ale, traditionally dated to around 1266 during the reign of Henry III, was the most comprehensively enforced commercial law in medieval English history. It did something genuinely elegant instead of fixing the price of bread, which would have been impossible to manage as grain prices fluctuated with every harvest. It fixed the relationship between the price of grain and the weight of the loaf. Here is how it worked in practice. The price of a loaf remained constant, always 1 farthing or 1/2 penny, or 1 penny depending on the grade. What changed was how much bread you got for that price. When wheat was cheap and abundant after a good harvest, your penny bought a heavier, larger loaf. When wheat was expensive after a bad season, the same penny bought a lighter, smaller one. The price never changed. The loaf adjusted. This meant that any buyer anywhere in the country knew exactly what price they would pay. What they did not know in advance was the weight that was posted publicly and changed seasonally. But the relationship was transparent and consistent. A buyer who felt they had been shorted could demand to have their loaf weighed against the posted standard. If the baker came up short, consequences followed, and the consequences in the records that survive are genuinely remarkable. In 1327, a group of London bakers appeared in court records charged with a particularly inventive form of fraud. They had been systematically producing underweight loaves, but had found a way to make them feel heavier than they were. The baker stalls happened constantly because the economic logic of it was undeniable. The courts record fine after fine for reg rating levied against the same individuals week after week, which suggests strongly that the fine was simply treated as a business cost, a predictable tax on a profitable activity. Now, outside the circle of local women vendors and the ambiguous figures of hewers and regraders, there was another category of market presence that shaped commerce in profound ways and whose story tends to be told either too simply or not at all. The foreign merchants. By the 12th and 13th centuries, major English markets, and particularly the great fairs that drew traders from across Europe, featured merchants who had traveled hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles to be there. The Italians came first, and came most powerfully. Venetians and Genoese, whose trading networks stretched from the Levant to northern Europe. Florentines, whose banking families had developed financial instruments, so sophisticated letters of credit bills of exchange, early forms of insurance that they were essentially inventing the architecture of modern commerce. These Italian merchants did not stay at inns. They had permanent quarters in London. The area that became known as Lombard Street in the city of London took its name directly from the Lombard merchants, those from the Lombardy region of northern Italy, who established themselves there in the 13th and 14th centuries. The Germans arrived next, organized into the remarkable trading alliance that history knows as the Hanseatic League. Their headquarters in London was called the Steelyard, a fortified compound along the Thames where Hanseatic merchants lived, worked, and stored their goods in an almost completely self-contained community. They had their own rules, their own governance, their own church. They ate together, prayed together, and traded together. A charter of 133 confirmed their exemption from the tolls that other foreign merchants had to pay, a privilege so commercially significant that it gave them a structural advantage over their competitors for more than 2 centuries. What did the English feel about all these foreigners who had come to trade in their markets? The answer is complicated, as it usually is. They needed them. The volume and variety of goods that Italian and Hanseatic merchants brought into English markets was beyond what purely domestic trade could have supplied. But needed and welcomed are not the same thing. There were periodic outbreaks of hostility toward foreign merchants, moments when accumulated resentment at their privileges, at their insularity, at the perception that they were extracting profit from England without contributing to it, boiled over into something uglier. The Hanseatic merchants in the Steelyard lived in a fortified compound, partly because a fortified compound was prudent. It had happened before the merchants' quarters had been attacked. And then there is the story that requires the most care to tell, and that I think is the most important one in understanding the full human picture of who was and was not permitted to participate in the medieval market economy. The Jewish community in medieval England. The history here is not simple, and I want to resist the temptation to flatten it. Jewish merchants and financiers had been present in England since the Norman conquest, invited by William the Conqueror because they possessed skills and financial knowledge the kingdom needed. For 2 centuries, they played a critical role in the English economy, particularly in money lending. The lending of money at interest was prohibited to Christians by church law, which left a genuine gap in the financial system. a gap that Jewish merchants filled because the same prohibition did not apply to them in transactions with non-Jews. This was not a freely chosen position. It was a role that Christian law and practice pushed Jewish communities into and then turned around and used as justification for treating them as morally suspect. Resentment built not despite Jewish financial services being valuable, but precisely because they were valuable and people resented needing them. One name that cuts through the abstractions here is Aaron of Lincoln, a 12th century Jewish financier who by the time of his death was estimated to be worth around $100,000, which may have made him wealthier than King Henry II himself. Aaron financed the construction of 9 Cistercian monasteries, various cathedrals, and several castles. When he died, his entire estate was seized by the crown because Jewish wealth in England was legally treated as ultimately belonging to the king. The wealth that Aaron had spent a lifetime building was absorbed overnight into royal coffers.
This pattern.
Jewish communities permitted to accumulate financial resources, then taxed exorbitantly, then stripped of protections, then ultimately expelled repeated itself with terrible consistency. In 1290, King Edward I issued the Edict of Expulsion, removing the entire Jewish population from England. Historians estimate that somewhere between 16,000 and perhaps fewer people were forced to leave the only country many of them had ever known. Parliament agreed to this expulsion in exchange for a tax grant worth £116,000, the largest single tax of the medieval period. A community was traded for a budget line. Jewish people did not return to England legally for more than 350 years. I think about the market stalls in London, in York, in Lincoln after 1290, and what was simply absent. The goldsmiths, the physicians, the merchants, the scholars, a diverse community reduced in popular memory and in legislation to a single caricatured role and then removed entirely. The gap they left was filled.
It usually is.
Italian bankers from Lombard Street stepped into the financial functions. But what could not be filled was the absence itself, the particular texture of a community that had been part of English commercial and cultural life for 200 years and was now simply gone. What does all of this tell us? Taken together. What does it mean that the vendors of the medieval market included aloes? Were set up over a hidden surface below a kind of concealed board, into which a small quantity of dough was pressed from below, while the loaf was handed across to the customer. The extra dough stayed at the stall. The loaf went home lighter than it appeared. When investigators raided their homes and workshops, they found the evidence they needed. The punishment that followed was designed to be memorable. The offending bakers were placed in pillories, the wooden restraining boards that held a person's head and hands in the public market square where they had operated. And they did not go to the pillory alone. Each fraudulent loaf was tied around the baker's neck so the crowd could see exactly what the crime had been and what it had looked like in practice. There is something both harsh and oddly logical about that image. The punishment perfectly mapped to the offense.
You sold false bread.
Here is the bread. Here is the falseness. Stand here and let everyone who bought from you see what you did. This was not an isolated case. The records of medieval English courts, memorial courts, bureau courts, royal-sized courts are full of bread fraud cases. Some bakers baked loaves with coins or scraps of metal hidden inside to add weight when the bread was assessed. Others kept their properly weighted loaves prominently displayed for inspection, while selling lighter ones from a hidden supply. Others still simply sold bread that was slightly underweight across the board, calculating that the fine when caught was cheaper than the profit from consistently short measuring. And here is the detail that I keep coming back to, the one that really illuminates the mindset of the people involved. Many bakers were fined for the same violation repeatedly. The same names appear in court records year after year, paying the same fine, continuing the same practice. The fine was not a deterrent. It was a business cost built into the pricing model. Pay the fine, keep the scheme, do the math. In this sense, medieval bread fraud had achieved something very modern. It had priced regulatory risk into its operating costs. But bakers were by no means the only creative fraudsters in the medieval market. Let us talk about some of the others because they are genuinely extraordinary. Cloth merchants faced their own system of regulation and their own temptations. The quality and width of cloth was supposed to meet defined standards. Inspectors existed specifically to check that cloth was woven to the correct thread count and the correct width. Wool weavers discovered that if you stretched the cloth before weaving it, the finished product would look wider and fuller than it actually was. When the cloth relaxed after purchase, it shrank. The customer got less than they thought. This was documented in medieval court records. The cloth was stretched. It was sold. It shrank. The merchant was fined. The merchant stretched the next batch. Spice merchants, and here we enter genuinely sophisticated fraud territory, given how expensive the products were, had their own repertoire. Pepper worth 4 shillings a pound in the 13th century, and therefore an enormous temptation for creative accounting, was sometimes sold damp. Wet pepper weighed more than dry pepper. By the time the customer got home and the pepper dried out, they'd paid full price for less spice than they thought. An ancient writer documenting the trade noted that merchants sometimes sprinkled lethargia-lead compound over old pepper to make it heavier and appear fresher. Old pepper is light, as any trader knew. Heavy pepper looked new. The customer paid for freshness they were not getting. And lead, of course, is not a spice. Saffron, that extraordinarily expensive dried flour that we discussed in Part 4, worth weeks of wages per pound, attracted fraud so elaborate that the city of Nuremberg in Germany passed a special law code called the Saffron Show, meaning the saffron inspection in the 15th century, specifically to combat it. Fraudsters mixed genuine saffron threads with the very similar-looking stamens of marigolds and other flowers, which had no flavor or color value whatsoever. They stored saffron in damp conditions to absorb water and add weight. They soaked threads in honey or oil for the same purpose. The Saffron Show imposed genuinely serious consequences for saffron fraud. We're talking about punishments severe enough to function as a genuine deterrent, which was unusual enough to be worth noting in Nuremberg. At least the fraud was controlled. Elsewhere in Europe, it continued merrily. Now, you might be wondering, how did buyers protect themselves in a system where fraud was this common and this varied? The short answer is experience, reputation, and community knowledge. Medieval market buyers were not passive. They were experienced, often sharpied, and deeply aware of the tricks that could be played on them. A regular market goer knew how a properly weighted loaf should feel in the hand. They knew what fresh pepper smelled like versus damp pepper. They knew which cloth merchant had been fined recently and which one had an unblemished record. In a world before consumer reviews, before brand names, before any of the institutional mechanisms we use today to assess quality and trust, reputation was the only currency that really counted, and it was tracked by the entire community. This is actually where the just price concept operated most powerfully in practice, not as an abstract theological doctrine, but as a lived social reality. A merchant who cheated in a small community where everyone knew everyone could not outrun their reputation. They had to show up at the same market square week after week, face to face with the same people they had sold to before. The invisible hand of the market in the medieval world had a very literal face, the face of the person standing across the stall from you, and it had a very long memory, which is not to say the system was perfect. It manifestly was not. Fraud continued because fraud was profitable and because catching it was difficult. But the medieval market was not naive about its own vulnerabilities. It built inspection systems, posted regulations, held courts, collected fines, and when all else failed, dragged bakers through the streets with fraudulent loaves around their necks. And here's the part one find quietly funny, though it is also genuinely touching. The reason we still say a baker's dozen today, meaning 13 rather than 12, traces directly to this exact regulatory pressure. Bakers who lacked accurate scales or whose ovens were uneven, or who simply could not afford the risk of being caught short on weight, again began adding a 13th loaf to every dozen they sold. 13 for the price of 12. Not generosity, insurance. The extra loaf was called the inbred or vantage loaf, and it was quite specifically a hedge against the pillory. Medieval marketing strategy, born of medieval fear. That phrase has traveled 8 centuries from those flour-dusted market stalls to every bakery and donut shop that still uses it today. Not many medieval legal concepts survive that well. The baker's dozen managed it by embedding itself in the language before anyone thought to ask where it came from. If all of this sounds like a system that was simultaneously principled and completely chaotic, well, that is precisely what it was. The medieval market believed deeply in fairness, regulated obsessively toward fairness, punished departures from fairness with theatrical public drama, and was riddled with unfairness from top to bottom. This is not a contradiction. It is just what happens when human beings try to build any system at all. The ideal and the reality shake hands and get to work, and the gap between them generates most of history. But there is a layer of the medieval market we've not yet reached. A layer that operated not through individual cheating and its individual consequences, but through organized institutional power. The kind of power that did not need to steal a few grams of pepper or hollow out a loaf, because it controlled the entire infrastructure through which those transactions happened. The guilds, we have mentioned them before. We have seen their influence on the layout of stalls, their role in protecting or excluding different categories of vendor. But we have not yet gone inside to look at how they actually worked at the extraordinary system of masters and journeymen and apprentices. The decadesal long climb from novice to independence, and the hidden mechanism by which, by the end of the Middle Ages, the door to full membership had quietly been locked from the inside. That is what we're going to examine next. There is a word in English that we use casually almost without thinking every single day. We talk about someone being a journeyman, maybe a footballer who played for a dozen clubs without ever quite becoming a star, or a director who made competent films but never had a masterpiece. We use it to mean someone who is adequate, reliable, not quite exceptional. What most people do not know is that the word comes from somewhere very specific. And the story it carries, if you follow it back to its source, turns out to be one of the most quietly devastating stories in the entire history of medieval labor. Let us go inside the guild, not the idea of it, which is vague and comfortable, the medieval equivalent of a professional association, something that regulated quality and trained young people and kept standards high. All of that is true as far as it goes, but the interior reality of how guilds actually operated from the perspective of the people moving through them was considerably more complex than that version suggests. Start at the beginning. The apprentice, a boy, almost always a boy, though not always, entered a guild system, typically around the age of 7 to 14, depending on the trade in the town. He was placed formally in the household of a master craftsman through a legal contract called an indenture, a document that bound him to that master for a fixed term. The average length of an apprenticeship across most trades in medieval England was roughly 7 years. In demanding trades, goldsmithing for instance, where the technical requirements were extraordinarily precise, the apprenticeship could extend to 10 years, or even longer. During those years, the apprentice lived in the master's household. He ate the master's food, slept under the master's roof, wore clothes provided by the master. He received no wages. What he received instead was instruction. The accumulated knowledge of the craft passed down from one human being to another through daily proximity, demonstration, correction, and repetition. The knowledge itself was treated in many guilds as a kind of protected asset. The word that medieval people used for the skills of a trade was mystery, from the Latin word for craft or professional skill. And the mystery of a guild was genuinely guarded. You were not allowed to teach it to outsiders. You were not allowed to practice it without membership. The knowledge had a fence around it, and the fence was legal. Now, an important question. Was the master always honest about the length of the apprenticeship? The historical record suggests with a quiet clarity that the answer was not always yes. A master craftsman received free labor during the years his apprentice served him. The longer the apprenticeship lasted, the more of that free labor he extracted. Historians who have studied medieval guild contracts have noted that there was a documented temptation, not always resisted, to extend apprenticeships beyond their genuinely necessary educational length, and that the legal system offered limited protection to the apprentice who felt this was happening to him 7 years. Think about that from the perspective of the boy. He entered the master's household perhaps at age 10. He emerged perhaps at 17. His entire adolescence passed in a single household under a single authority in exchange for education and room and board and no money whatsoever. And at the end of those 7 years, he did not become a full member of the guild. He became something else first. He became a journeyman. The word journeyman does not come from the act of traveling. Though journeymen often did travel, it comes from the French word journey, meaning a day. A journeyman was literally someone who worked for a day's wages. He had completed his training. He was qualified to practice his craft, but he was not yet a master, and without mastery, he had no independent standing in the guild system. He could not open his own workshop. He could not take on his own apprentices. He could not contract with customers in his own name. He worked for masters for wages for as long as it took to make the transition to the next level. In the early medieval period, the transition was relatively straightforward. A journeyman who had practiced his craft for a few years, saved enough money, and produced a piece of work, the famous masterpiece, the demonstration of technical excellence that the guild would assess could apply to become a master. If his masterpiece was accepted and he could afford the fees and formalities he was in, he could open his shop. He could train apprentices. He had arrived. This is the version of the guild system that gets described in the history books, and it is accurate for a particular period and a particular set of circumstances. But here is what those history books sometimes fail to mention. By the later medieval period, roughly the 14th century onward, something had begun to change, and the change was not good news for journeymen. As the great guilds of London and the major cities grew richer, more politically powerful and more conscious of their own status, the barriers to becoming a master quietly began to rise. The fees required for membership increased substantially. The masterpiece requirements became more elaborate and more subjective, which meant that the men assessing the work existing masters had more discretion to fail applicants whose work was actually skilled enough, but whose faces, for various reasons, did not fit. The number of apprentices a master could take on was sometimes capped, which limited the flow of new masters through the system. And perhaps most significantly, the existing masters began to recognize something that their economic interests pointed toward very clearly. The more journeymen there were, the cheaper labor was. And the cheaper labor was, the more profitable it was to run a workshop. The result, documented in guild records from the late 14th and 15th centuries, was the emergence of a class of permanent journeymen. Men who had completed their apprenticeships, who were genuinely skilled, who had produced masterpieces of reasonable quality, but who found that the door to full mastery was functionally closed. Not officially closed, the guild would never admit to a policy of exclusion, but practically closed through a combination of cost politics and the subtle power of existing masters to control whose application succeeded and whose did not. What happened to these men? Some traveled from city to city, which is where the idea of the journeyman as a wanderer comes from, working here for a season, therefore another season, never settling because settling required a mastery they could not achieve. Some spent their entire working lives in the employ of masters who in a different era they might have equaled in status. Some grew old in the trade without ever owning the workshop they labored in. This is where the modern meaning of the word journeyman comes from. Not from someone mediocre, from someone capable, even skilled, who was systematically prevented from rising by a structure that served the interests of those already at the top. It is a story about a trap, and it is a very old story. Let me tell you specifically about the guild whose history I find the most instructive because it illustrates almost everything important about how this system worked at its most powerful and its most politically intertwined, the Worshipful Company of Goldsmiths. London's goldsmiths had been organized as a formal body since at least the 12th century, but it was in the 13th and 14th centuries that their power became truly formidable. The reason was simple and practical. Gold and silver were money. Any society that used metal coinage needed people who could assess the quality of that metal, who could look at a coin or a piece of jewelry and say with authority what it was worth and whether it was genuine. This made goldsmiths not just craftsmen, but the primary guardians of financial trust in an era when the integrity of coinage was a matter of national security. By 1300, the leopard's head, first introduced by King Edward I as the official mark of authentication, was being struck into gold and silver articles at Goldsmiths' Hall. This is where the term hallmark comes from. The hall, the goldsmith's hall. When you use that word today, when you describe anything as having the hallmark of quality or authenticity, you are using a word born in the building where 14th century London goldsmiths brought their work to be tested and marked. 800 years of linguistic persistence carried in a single syllable. The goldsmiths' political reach extended considerably beyond their craft. By the 14th century, guild membership in London had become a prerequisite, not just for trading, but for voting and civic participation. No one could stand for office in the city in most cases without belonging to one of the major guilds. And the most powerful guilds, The mercers, the grocers, the drapers, the fishmongers, the goldsmiths, and a handful of others that would eventually be formalized as the 12 great livery companies effectively constituted the political governing class of London. The court of aldermen in the 14th century was populated almost entirely by members of these companies. Being a merchant, grocer, or a goldsmith was not just a commercial identity. It was a political one. And this is where the system becomes genuinely extraordinary in the sense of genuinely troubling. The guild was presenting itself as a meritocracy, as an institution that trained people to high standards and then rewarded excellence with advancement. And in some respects, the masterpiece system was real. The quality. Inspections were real. The protection of consumers through standard enforcement was real. But at the same time, the guild was also a closed political club. And the relationship between commercial excellence and political access ran in both directions. You needed the guild to trade. You needed the trade to fund your guild membership. You needed the guild membership to vote. And the people who controlled guild membership controlled who could join. The loop was closed, and it had been closed from the inside. The guild was also, and this is worth sitting with for a moment, a deeply human institution in ways that go beyond economics and politics. Because the members of a guild did not just work together. They lived together in many respects. They attended the same church services. They marched together in civic processions. They were required to attend the funerals of fellow members and to contribute financially to the families of members who died in poverty. When a master fell ill and could no longer work, the guild was supposed to support him. When his widow was left without income, the guild was supposed to help her, usually by permitting her to continue the trade for a limited period, provided she did not remarry, and provided no male heir appeared to take over. This is the aspect of the guild that tends to get lost in purely economic analyses. It was a welfare system. It was a social network. It was a source of identity that went beyond the simple question of what you made or sold. A 14th century London draper did not merely belong to the draper's company. The draper's company was woven into his daily life, his religious practice, his social circle, his sense of who he was in the world. The guild hall was not just a regulatory office. It was a gathering place, a chapel, a meeting room, a bank, and a social club, all occupying the same building. You can still visit some of those buildings today. The oldest surviving parts of Merchant Taylor's Hall in London have been in continuous use for more than 600 years through the plague, the Great Fire to world wars, centuries of change that transformed every other aspect of life around them. The kitchen at Merchant Taylor's Hall has been in uninterrupted use since the 14th century. If you think about that for a moment, about what it means for a single room to have been in continuous human use for 600 years, there is something genuinely extraordinary in it. All that cooking, all those guild feasts, all those journeymen who ate in that hall and then went back to the workshop where they labored toward a mastery they might never achieve. Something I think about whenever I read the history of the guilds is this. Every institution that begins with the purpose of serving some genuine communal good, maintaining quality, training workers, protecting consumers, tends over time to develop a secondary interest in its own preservation and the welfare of its existing members. And those two interests are not always aligned. The guild that started as a mechanism for elevating craftsmen to their full potential became at its peak a mechanism for ensuring that not too many people were elevated too quickly, lest the value of existing membership be diluted. There is nothing uniquely medieval about this tendency, but the medieval guild makes it visible in an especially clear and documented way. The masterpiece that was assessed by men who had already passed that test themselves. The fees that were waived for sons of existing masters but required in full from outsiders. The apprenticeships that lasted longer than the learning required. The journeymen who wandered, and yet the guilds also built the cathedrals. They trained the craftsmen who made the stained glass windows and carved the stone faces on the gargoyles and laid the brass memorial plaques in the floors of parish churches. The knowledge they carried and protected and transmitted was real, and it produced work of extraordinary quality. The tension between exclusivity and excellence ran through every guild simultaneously. The same institution that locked the door on some people also produced through the same doorwork that 800 years later we still travel to see. That is not a contradiction. That resolves neatly. Some of the most human things do not. Now we have spent considerable time inside the market systems and institutions. The law, the charter, the layout, the vendors, the goods, the fraud, the guild. But there is a part of the medieval marketplace that we have barely touched. And it may be the most visceral, the most immediate, the most charged with something that feels like unmediated human life. Because when things went wrong, when the fraud was caught, when the rule was broken, when someone in the crowd was found to have done something that violated the market's moral order, the response was not a court notice and a fine in the post. It happened right there in the square, in front of everyone. And the crowd was not just a witness. It was the instrument. The justice of the medieval market is something we're going to look at very closely very soon. And I promise you, it is unlike anything else we have discussed so far. Imagine holding a single nutmeg in your hand, not the ground brown powder from a tin in your kitchen cupboard. An actual whole nutmeg the size of a large marble, hard and dense with a rough skin, and a faint warm woody smell that is almost sweet. Something you could close your fingers around completely and feel almost nothing in your palm. Now imagine that this small thing, this unremarkable looking seed the size of a marble, is worth more by weight than gold. Not in some ancient poetic sense, literally by the pound more than the actual gold coin sitting on the merchant's table beside it. That was the nutmeg in the medieval marketplace. And the story of how it got there, and what it meant to the person who bought it, and what the people who grew it knew about the people who bought it, which was essentially nothing, is one of the most extraordinary supply chain stories in the history of the world. And it began, in every case, roughly 6,000 miles away from where it ended. Let us start at the source, because almost nobody in a medieval European market had any accurate idea where their spices actually came from. This was not an accident.
It was a business strategy.
Cloves grew on a small group of islands in what is now eastern Indonesia, a volcanic chain so remote that for most of European history they did not appear on any European map. The islands were called at various times the Moluccas, or the Spice Islands. And that second name tells you everything about how the rest of the world thought of them. Not as places where people lived and built societies and had complex politics, but as sources. Clove trees, nutmeg trees, nothing else of interest. The fact that an entire civilization inhabited these islands and had been trading with China and India for 1,000 years before Europeans arrived to disrupt everything was, from the European perspective, largely irrelevant. Nutmeg was even more geographically concentrated than cloves. In the medieval period, nutmeg grew in meaningful quantities, essentially only on a small cluster within that same archipelago called the Banda Islands. A handful of volcanic dots in the Pacific Ocean, collectively smaller than the city of London, were the sole source of an ingredient that wealthy Europeans across the entire continent had come to regard as essential to fine cuisine, proper medicine, and sophisticated living. When you understand the geography, the price makes a kind of terrible sense. There was simply nowhere else to get it. Now, here is the journey that brought a nutmeg from those islands to a market stall in medieval England. And I want you to follow this slowly, because each step matters. The nutmeg left the Banda Islands on a local trading vessel, probably heading first toward the large Indonesian port city of Malacca. At Malacca, which by the 14th and 15th centuries had become one of the busiest trading ports in the world, where merchants from China, India, Arabia, and Southeast Asia all converged. The nutmeg might change hands for the first time. An Arab or Indian merchant would buy it in bulk, loading it onto a ship that would carry it westward across the Indian Ocean toward the coasts of India or toward the Arabian Peninsula. At some point along this journey, the nutmeg passed through another set of hands. Arab merchants who dominated the Indian Ocean trade during the medieval period were deeply interested in maintaining their commercial advantage. And one of the ways they maintained it was by keeping the precise origins of their goods mysterious. There are documented accounts of Arab traders telling elaborate stories to their European customers about where spices came from. Stories involving dangerous mountains, fierce winged creatures, treacherous forests precisely to justify the price and prevent anyone from trying to go get the spices directly. The geography of the Spice Islands was one of the best-kept trade secrets of the medieval world. The people who grew the nutmeg knew where they were. The people who bought the nutmeg in London had no idea. The Arab merchants would carry the spices to Alexandria in Egypt or to ports in the Levant. And there at that eastern end of the Mediterranean, The trade passed to the most powerful commercial actors in the medieval European world, the Venetians' Venice. This word comes up repeatedly whenever you try to understand the economics of the medieval spice trade. And it comes up because Venice had, through a combination of geographic luck, diplomatic skill, military power, and extraordinary commercial sophistication, achieved something that almost no city in history manages for long. A genuine monopoly on the supply of something the entire Western world wanted and had no alternative means of obtaining. From roughly the 10th century through the 15th, Venetian merchants were the gatekeepers between the spice-producing East and the consuming West. They bought in bulk from Arab merchants in Alexandria and the Levant, and then distributed to buyers from France, England, the Low Countries, and the German states. The markup they charged at each step of this process was, in a word, extraordinary. By the time a spice left Venice for a northern European market, its price might be 10, 20, even 30 times what it had cost when it first left its island of origin. Every hand it had passed through Bandar Islander, Malay trader, Indian merchant, Arab carrier, Venetian wholesaler had added their own margin, and at the end of that chain stood the spice merchant at the market stall in London or Paris, adding one final markup before presenting the little cloth bag to a customer who paid without complaint because there was no alternative. The Venetians understood this structural advantage so clearly that they devoted significant political and military resources to protecting it. The naval war of Chioggia in 1378 to 1381, in which Venice fought and decisively defeated Genoa, was a meaningful part of struggle over who would control the spice trade. Venice won for almost another century after that victory. No European power could seriously challenge Venetian dominance over the most profitable commercial route in the known world. Now, here's the thing that I promise to address because it comes up every time anyone starts talking about medieval spices, and it is one of those historical myths that refuses to die no matter how many scholars have tried to put it to rest. Did medieval people use expensive spices to cover up the smell and taste of rotten meat? The short answer, the answer that historians who have spent careers studying medieval food culture will give you clearly and directly is no. This is not what happened. And the reasoning is so obvious once you hear it that it is almost funny that the myth persisted as long as it did. Spices cost more than meat, significantly more. In the early 14th century in England, a pound of pepper, the cheapest of the major spices, cost roughly the same as a whole pig. A pound of cloves cost nearly 4.5 days' wages for a skilled craftsman. A pound of saffron could cost a craftsman an entire month's work. No rational economic actor, even in the 14th century, was going to spend 4.5 days' wages on clothes to sell a piece of rotten meat that cost a fraction of that. The arithmetic simply does not work. Paul Freire-Dedman, a historian at Yale University who spent years researching this exact question, for his book on spices and the medieval imagination, called this myth an urban legend, a story so instinctively attractive that mere fact seems unable to wipe it out. And he is right. The idea that medieval people were essentially drugging their decaying food with exotic spices has a kind of vivid unpleasantness to it that makes it memorable and shareable. But the evidence points in the opposite direction. The wealthy people who could afford spices could very easily afford fresh meat because fresh meat was cheap. The people who could not afford fresh meat could not remotely afford spices. The two groups did not overlap. So, why then were spices so desperately obsessively sought? What was actually driving the demand? The real answer has 3 layers, and each one is more interesting than the simple covering up rotten food story it replaces. The first layer is the most obvious one. Spices genuinely made food taste better. Medieval European cooking before the spice trade reached its height was not lacking in herbs. Sage, rosemary, thyme leeks, onions were all available locally. But pepper, cinnamon, ginger, nutmeg, and cloves offered flavors that simply did not exist in Northern European cooking before they arrived. They are genuinely exotic. They produce sensations on the palate that nothing grown locally could replicate. The pleasure was real, not merely symbolic. The second layer involves medicine. Medieval medical theory was built on the concept of humors. The idea that health depended on a balance between 4 bodily substances and that different foods and substances had heating, cooling, drying, or moistening properties that affected that balance. Spices in this framework were not neutral flavor agents. They were drugs. Pepper was heating and drying, useful for cold, wet conditions. Ginger warmed the stomach. Nutmeg was believed to strengthen the brain. Cinnamon supported the heart. A medieval physician prescribing spices was not doing something different from a medieval physician prescribing any other medicinal substance. They were applying the same theoretical framework, the same understanding of how the physical world interacted with the human body. The fact that the spices also happened to taste wonderful was, from this perspective, a happy coincidence. And the third layer is the one that Friedman's research illuminates most powerfully and that I find the most humanly revealing. Spices were status symbols. Not incidentally, primarily. The entire cultural meaning of spice in the medieval period was bound up with wealth, refinement, and proximity to the exotic. A medieval nobleman who served heavily spiced food at a feast was not just feeding his guests. He was demonstrating that he had access to something that came from the farthest edges of the known world, from places so distant that the spices had passed through a dozen hands and traveled thousands of miles to reach his table. There is a specific documented example that I keep coming back to. At the wedding of Duke George the Rich of Bavaria in 1476, the catering records show that the feast required 386 pounds of pepper, 286 pounds of ginger, 27 pounds of saffron, 205 of cinnamon, and 105 of cloves. At those prices for a single wedding, Duke George the Rich. The name tells you something. He was spending on spices what would have funded a small military campaign. And everyone at the feast understood this perfectly. Every bite of heavily spiced food at that table was a statement of power as clear and deliberate as the building they sat in and the clothes they wore. Think about what you have in your kitchen right now. A jar of pepper, some cinnamon, maybe nutmeg in a small tin, or a few cardamom pods. These things cost you essentially nothing. You bought them without a second thought, used a little, put them back on the shelf. For the vast majority of the medieval period, those same spices represented a form of wealth that most people never touched, smelled, or tasted in their entire lives. Peasants were, as the historical record notes, sometimes mocked precisely because they had never tasted any spice more exotic than pepper. And even pepper was a luxury beyond reach for most of them. The distance between that world and ours is not simply a matter of economics. It is a measure of the extraordinary global transformation that the spice trade set in motion. Because the desire to cut out the Venetian middleman to find a direct route to the Spice Islands and capture that 30 times markup for someone else is what sent Portuguese ships around the coast of Africa in the late 15th century. What sent Christopher Columbus westward across the Atlantic. What eventually brought Europeans to continents they had never known existed. The nutmeg in the Banda Islands and the astronomical markup it accumulated on its way to a medieval market stall is one of the reasons the modern world looks the way it does. I find it strange and wonderful that something so small, something you could hold between two fingers, had consequences that large. There is one last piece of the story I want to leave you with because it captures something essential about the relationship between the medieval spice trade and the world it created. The Venetian monopoly on spices lasted for centuries, but it was not the only monopoly that would be attempted. When the Dutch eventually wrested control of the Spice Islands from the Portuguese in the early 17th century, they tried something remarkable. They attempted to control the spice trade by controlling the very source, the nutmeg trees on the Banda Islands. They covered every nutmeg in lime before export so that the seeds could not be germinated and transplanted elsewhere. They imposed the death penalty on anyone who attempted to remove living plants from the islands. For decades, they maintained this botanical monopoly with extraordinary rigor. And yet it did not last forever. A single French missionary and botanist, a remarkable man named Pierre Puv, successfully smuggled nutmeg and clove seedlings out of the islands in the 18th century, beginning the process that eventually broke the Dutch monopoly and reduced these once astronomical prices to what you paid for that jar on your kitchen shelf. The spice that changed the world became, in the end, a condiment. But in a medieval market at the stall of the spice merchant with that cloth bag of nutmeg sitting on the wooden counter in the morning light, it was still magic. And the person reaching for it, the one who could afford it, knew exactly what they were buying. Not just flavor, not just medicine, Something that had come from the edge of the world carried on 1,000 miles of wind and water and human effort to rest for a moment in their hand. We have been spending a lot of our time in the daytime hours of this market in the commerce, the economics, the systems of power and exchange. But there is a part of the market's daily life that we have only glimpsed. A part that happened in full daylight right at the center of the square when the business of buying and selling suddenly paused and everyone turned to watch something else entirely. When the market became not a place of commerce but a place of justice, and sometimes something that looked very much like theater. That moment is waiting for us just on the other side of this hour of the market day. And what happened there in that square in front of all those witnesses? It is unlike anything else in this entire story. By midday, the market had become something else entirely. The morning crowds, the farmers and traders and early buyers who'd been there since the bell rang, had done much of their business. Sacks of grain had been weighed and handed over. Agnes, with her eggs, had sold most of what she brought. The serious transactions, the ones that required early light and clear heads, were largely complete. And now a different kind of commerce was beginning. The kind that required heat, that required fire, that required someone to stand over an open flame in the middle of a crowded square and cry out to passing strangers hot pies. Hot pies here. If you want to understand the medieval market as a living, breathing experience, not as an economic system or a legal structure, but as a human place where people actually spent their hours and satisfied their bodies. This is where you need to be. Right here at midday in the thick of it with the smoke rising from the cookshop stalls and the smell of something sizzling and fat cutting through all the other smells of the morning. Here is something that often surprises people. A significant portion of the medieval urban population could not cook at home. Not because they lacked the skill, because they lacked the equipment. In a large medieval city, a huge number of workers and residents lived in single rented rooms or crowded tenements divided into multiple households or dormitory-style lodgings with no individual hearth. Ovens were expensive to build, expensive to heat, and represented a genuine fire risk in towns where buildings were packed tightly together and made largely of timber. The historical record shows that many medieval English towns passed ordinances restricting or prohibiting private cooking fires in densely inhabited areas precisely because of the fire danger. Building your own oven in a crowded medieval street was not just impractical. In many cases, it was illegal, and so the cook shop existed, the medieval version of fast food operating centuries before anyone had invented the term. These were not restaurants in any modern sense. They were stalls and shops with kitchens at the front, often open to the street, where you could buy prepared food without sitting down, without waiting for a table, without even necessarily stopping walking. The London, a size of bread nail from the 13th century onward, and the Liber Albus, the great civic record of London, compiled in 1419, both contain references to the food stalls and cookshops that fed the city's working population as a matter of daily necessity rather than occasional indulgence. What did they sell? This is where it gets genuinely wonderful. William Fitzstephen, a 12th century writer who gave us one of the most vivid descriptions of medieval London that survives, described the cookshops along the Thames as a place where you could find roasted meats, fried fish, and various pies available at any hour. A dock worker finishing a long shift could buy a hot meat pie and eat it walking. A craftsman taking a break from his work could grab a skewer of salted and roasted fish, the medieval equivalent of a kebab for a few pennies, hot sheep's feet, strawberries in season, hot peas in their pods. A poem from the 15th century called London Lickpenny. A beautifully named piece about a naive visitor from the countryside navigating London for the first time captures the vendor calls that fill the air of the medieval street market with remarkable specificity. Hot pest gods one cried meaning hot peas, strawberry, ripe cherries in the branch, and then hot sheep's feet, and then rushes fair and green are each voice layering over the next in a street-level soundtrack that would have been immediately familiar to anyone who spent time in a medieval market town. The pies deserve particular attention because they were perhaps the defining food of the medieval street market, and their story is both delicious and, in typical medieval fashion, somewhat complicated. The medieval market pie was not the refined, delicate pastry thing that the word pie might conjure today. It was a practical object. The crust called the coffin in medieval culinary language, which tells you something about the aesthetic priorities at work, was thick, dense, and designed primarily as a container for the filling rather than as something you were necessarily meant to eat. You held it in your hand, or you kept it on a plate if you were being somewhat civilized about things, and you ate the filling with a spoon. Sometimes you ate the crust as well, sometimes you did not. It depended on how hungry you were and how appetizing the crust looked, which was not always a straightforward assessment. The fillings were varied and inventive. Meat pies filled with pork beef or minced offal fish pies. And in the more elaborate versions, the ones made for wealthier customers who could afford complexity, remarkable combinations that modern palates would find genuinely disorienting. One surviving 14th century recipe for what it calls a tarte d'ebrim. A fish pie contains salmon or haddock combined with figs, raisins, apples, and pears. Fish and fruit in the same crust, seasoned with spices. This sounds strange to us, but remember that medieval food was organized around a medical dietary theory that valued the balancing of different humoral properties in a single dish, hot with cold, moist with dry. And within that framework, the combination made a kind of systematic sense. The world they were eating in was not our world, and their food reflected it. Now, the elephant in the room. The question I should address directly, because it comes up every time anyone discusses medieval eating and drinking habits. Did medieval people drink ale instead of water because the water was too dangerous? This is another one of those historical myths that has achieved remarkable cultural longevity. Despite being substantially more complicated than its popular version suggests, the full truth, as historians who have spent serious time with the primary sources will tell you, is nuanced in ways the simple myth is not. Medieval people certainly drank ale. They drank it in substantial quantities. Records from late 13th century London suggest that cathedral workers received an allowance of roughly a gallon of ale per person per day, which sounds extraordinary until you remember that this was the standard daily provision for physical laborers doing serious work. The ale in question was not what we would call strong ale today. Medieval ale, without hops being a later introduction from the Low Countries, was a short-lived, lightly fermented drink relatively low in alcohol by modern standards, and it did not keep long. It was made fresh, consumed quickly, and was consumed by people who were also eating bread and pottage and doing hard physical work. But did they drink ale exclusively treating water as a mortal danger? The historical record complicates this picture considerably. Medieval people could and did drink water from wells, from springs, from running streams, and they were perfectly capable of distinguishing between water that looked and smelled clean and water that did not. A 9th century abbot of friars writing about healthy drinking practices recommended water drawn from a clear well or the current of a transparent brook and specifically advised against cloudy or muddy water. That is not the language of someone who thinks all water is poison. That is the language of someone who knows the difference between good water and bad water and is giving sensible practical advice. The more accurate picture is one where ale was genuinely preferred. Not because water was universally dangerous, but because ale provided calories, flavor, and a mild preservation process that water simply did not. In a world without refrigeration, without pasteurization, without any of the mechanisms we use to keep drinks fresh, a lightly alcoholic beverage that had gone through fermentation was more reliably safe over time than standing water of uncertain provenance. In a crowded market town with open sewers and no sewage system, being cautious about water sources was entirely rational. But rural people who had access to clean running springs drank water. Travelers drank water when they found it. Children drank very weak ale, often mixed with water. The medieval relationship with hydration was more flexible and more sensible than the myth suggests. What is genuinely true is that at the market the ale seller was doing some of the most important business of the day. A market full of people needed to drink something, and ale sold from stalls and carried in jugs by sellers who wandered through the crowd was the answer. But now I want to tell you about the danger that was genuinely present in market food. Not the romanticized danger of rotten meat covered in spices, which, as we established in our spice discussion, was not how things worked. The actual documented, historically attested danger of eating food prepared by people who had every incentive to cut corners. Geoffrey Chaucer, that great observer of medieval life, gave us a cook character in the Canterbury Tales, a London cook named Hodgedge of Ware. Chaucer describes him with almost gleeful, unflattering specificity, a man with a running saw on his knee who made blank manger a thick sweet fish or chicken dish that Chaucer implies is best not examined too closely. This was not just comedy. It was social commentary that the audience would have recognized instantly because it reflected a genuine and widespread concern about the quality of food sold in cookshops. A French cardinal named Jacques de Vitry, writing in the early 13th century, described sellers of cooked meat as an outright health hazard. An English monk from the early 15th century named John Lydgate wrote with memorable directness that hot fire and smoke produced many a filthy cook. The literary tradition of the disreputable cookshop was not simply satire. It was based on observation. Here is what the civic records actually show was happening. Cookshops in medieval cities operated with minimal oversight and inconsistent enforcement of the regulations that did exist. In London, Paris, and York, municipal records document cases of cooked food being sold that contained meat of questionable freshness or quality. More specifically, and this is where the historical record becomes very vivid, there were documented cases of pies being filled with meat that had come from animals that died of disease rather than being properly slaughtered. This was cheaper for the cook and essentially invisible to the buyer who was eating the filling without being able to examine the original ingredients. The civic authorities in London tried to address this. There are records of inspectors examining cooked meat at market stalls. There are fines levied for selling unfit food. And there are also records of the same violations recurring at the same establishments, which tells you that the inspection regime was not always effective and that the profit motive was sometimes stronger than the regulatory pressure. Now, I want to offer some perspective here because the picture I have just described could easily leave you imagining the medieval market food scene as a kind of sustained culinary catastrophe.
It was not quite that.
The vast majority of people who ate market food did not immediately become ill. Their bodies had calibrated over a lifetime to a microbial environment very different from ours, and their immune systems were correspondingly different. The dangers were real, but they were not dramatic enough to prevent millions of people from buying and eating market food every single week for centuries. What the dangers do reveal is something important about the nature of the market relationship between seller and buyer. Reputation mattered, as we have discussed throughout this story, but reputation had limits. A pie seller in a large market serving people from outlying villages who would not return until the following week had less reputational accountability than a merchant with a permanent stall serving the same regular customers. The more anonymous the transaction, the greater the scope for corners to be cut. There is one more element of medieval market eating that I want to bring in because it connects the food experience to something larger about how people spent their time in the marketplace. Eating was not private. You ate where you were standing at a stall or walking through the crowd, and you ate in full view of everyone around you. The market at midday was a scene of collective nourishment. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of people eating simultaneously in public in the middle of a busy commercial space. Children with bits of bread, workers with pies, merchants pausing their negotiations to eat a skewer of fish, and around all of them always, the noise and movement and smell of the market continuing without pause. This was the original communal dining experience, not in a hall with benches and a formal table, which was the elite version of the same human need, but here in the open air in the middle of commerce, eating something hot that had been cooked by a stranger over an open fire, surrounded by the same people you were doing business with that morning. I find something genuinely moving in that image. Not romantic, exactly. The food was sometimes questionable. The hygiene was occasionally alarming. And the crowd was never quiet. But human, thoroughly, unmistakably human. The need to stop to eat to be fed, to stand for a moment in the middle of everything, and take in something warm. That midday pause is nearly over now. The food has been eaten. The ale cup set down the business of the afternoon, beginning to reassemble itself around the stalls. And as the crowd thickens again, as the noise rises back to its daytime pitch, something shifts in the center of the square. A space opens up. A murmur runs through the crowd. Someone has been caught. Someone is going to face justice right here, right now, while everyone watches. Because the medieval market was not only about what you bought and what you ate. It was about what happened when you were caught breaking the rules. And that story, the story of market justice, public punishment, and the extraordinary theater of medieval law in action is one that I have been looking forward to telling you since the very beginning of this long evening together. Something was happening at the center of the square. The trading had not stopped. It never really stopped during market hours, but a murmur was moving through the crowd. The kind of sound that spreads faster than information that passes from person to person before anyone can quite say what they have heard or where they heard it. People were turning. People were drifting away from their stalls and their baskets and their negotiated transactions, and moving in that unhurried but purposeful way that crowds have toward a particular point in the market square toward the pillory. And what was locked into it, hands and head immobilized between the hinged wooden boards, was a baker from the northern end of the market. His name is not recorded. What is recorded in the bureau court rolls from dozens of medieval English towns in the kind of meticulous administrative detail that medieval clerks devoted to even the most quotidian acts of justice is what he had done. He had been found selling bread that weighed less than the law required.
Not for the first time.
The court records show it was the third time, and on the third offense in many towns, the fine was no longer sufficient. The third time you stood in the pillory in the market square at noon, when everyone was there. I want to stay with this image for a moment before we move into the mechanics of it, because I think it captures something important about medieval justice that gets lost when we discuss it purely in terms of rules and punishments. The medieval market was not just a place of commerce.
It was a place of moral accounting.
Every transaction that happened there carried what the theologians of the time would have called ethical weight. The obligation of the just price, the duty of honest measure, the requirement to treat the buyer fairly as a fellow member of the community. When someone violated that obligation, the response was not primarily punitive in the private bureaucratic sense that we might recognize. It was social. It was communal. It was theatrical. And it was designed to happen right here in the place where the violation occurred in front of the people who had been affected by it. The punishment was not separate from the market. The punishment was part of the market. Let us talk about what these devices actually were, because popular imagination has blurred the distinctions between them in ways that matter. The pillory and the stocks are often confused, which is understandable given that both serve the same general purpose of public humiliation, but they were physically quite different, and their differences were legally meaningful. The stocks restrained the feet. The offender sat or lay on the ground, ankles locked between the hinge boards, hands free. This was considered the less severe of the two devices appropriate for lesser offenses. Petty drunkenness, minor disorder, first time or minor trading violations. It was uncomfortable certainly, and the exposure to public mockery was real, and sometimes quite unpleasant. But the person in the stocks could use their hands to ward off thrown objects, could cover their face, could partially manage their humiliation. The pillory was something else. It stood on a post raised above the ground, forcing the person to bend forward with head and both hands thrust through the holes in the wooden frame. This posture was inherently degrading. The person could not stand upright, could not protect their face, could not gesture freely, and it placed them at exactly the right height for the crowd around them to look them directly in the eye. The whole design was oriented toward a specific goal: maximum visibility, maximum shame, maximum exposure to whatever the crowd decided to express. Edward I in the 13th century enacted that every pillory should be made strong enough to hold offenders without peril to their bodies. This rather touching concern for structural engineering tells you that the pilloried person was expected to be subjected to significant force.
They were not simply displayed.
They were targets. What the crowd threw is documented in the historical record with a range that goes from the mundane to the alarming. Rotten vegetables and eggs were standard. Mud refuse collected conveniently from the market's own gutters. Dead animals. In cases where the offense had involved a particular product, the crowd sometimes used that product as their ammunition. A baker who had cheated on weights might find himself being pelted with bread, which was both symbolically appropriate and physically harmless, though no doubt humiliating. In cases where the crowd felt particularly strongly about what the person had done, the objects could become genuinely dangerous stones, and bricks were sometimes thrown. And the historical record does contain cases of people being seriously injured or killed while in the pillory. The authorities, when they noticed this escalation happening, were occasionally concerned about it, not primarily because they worried about the well-being of the pilloried person. The punishment was supposed to be unpleasant, but because uncontrolled crowd behavior threatened the authority of the judicial system itself. If the crowd killed someone who had been sentenced to stand in the pillory for 3 hours, the court had lost control of its own punishment. The fine line between sanctioned public humiliation and something darker was a line that medieval authorities were aware of and tried with mixed success to maintain. There is a particular form of market punishment that I find genuinely fascinating and that captures the medieval philosophy of justice perhaps more clearly than anything else. The idea that the punishment should visibly, physically match the crime. We've already discussed how bakers who sold underweight bread might be dragged through the streets on a hurdle with their fraudulent loaves tied around their necks. But there were other versions of this matching logic that are equally vivid. A tavern keeper in medieval London who was found selling wine that was putrid, corrupt, and altogether unsound for human use. And that precise phrase appears in civic records, was sentenced to be tied to a post in a public place surrounded by what the records describe as vile minstrelsy, meaning a deliberately cacophonous group of musicians and noise makers hired specifically to draw a crowd. The offending wine was then poured over his head, and the bottle smashed. The instrument of the offense became the instrument of the punishment. There was also the curious and specifically market-related device called the cucking stool, also known in later periods as the ducking stool. In medieval usage, and this is somewhat different from the later version that most people recognize, the cucking stool was a seat on wheels, a kind of portable chair of shame that could be drawn through the streets of the town while its occupant was exposed to the crowd. The word cucking comes from an Old English word that suggested something deeply undignified, and the stool had been associated in many records with those who engaged in dishonest trade, as well as with what the law called common scolds, people, usually women, deemed to be disrupting the social peace through excessive and quarrelsome speech. The later version, which was mounted on a long beam over water and used to physically submerge the person, developed gradually. By the 15th and 16th centuries, it had become more specifically associated with female offenders, reflecting the way the legal and social system of the period projected anxieties about women's speech and behavior onto a particular device of public humiliation. A London report from 1535 describes a group of women sentenced to be taken to a fowl pond in Smithfield, placed upon the cucking stool, and washed over the years. A crowd of 2,000 to 3,000 people by one later account could gather to witness a ducking in a Surrey town. But there is another form of market justice that I find perhaps the most fascinating of all, and it is the one least known to modern people. It has a name that sounds so improbable that your first instinct might be to assume it was invented by someone with a very particular sense of humor. It is called the Court of Pie Powder. Say that out loud. Court of Pie Powder. It sounds like the judicial system of a particularly chaotic pastry shop. The name comes from the French words poudre, meaning dusty feet. And the reason it refers to dusty feet is at once poetic and entirely practical. The traders who traveled from fair to fair and market to market, covering enormous distances on foot, arrived with the dust of the road, literally coating their shoes and clothes. They were the itinerant merchants, the people who had traveled far enough to need justice administered quickly because they could not wait weeks for a regular court session. They had to be back on the road. The Court of Pie Powder was quite simply a court that sat in the market itself for the duration of the market and resolved disputes on the spot. No delays, no waiting for the next term of court, no lengthy deliberation. As the 18th century legal scholar William Blackton described it, it was the lowest and at the same time the most expeditious court of justice known to the law of England. It was designed by intent to resolve a case within the space of an hour before the fair ended and the merchants dispersed. Think about what this means practically. You're a cloth merchant from Winchester who has traveled 2 days to attend the Starbridge Fair near Cambridge, which in the 14th century could last for 5 weeks and was one of the largest commercial events in England. You sell a bolt of cloth to a buyer from York and a dispute immediately arises about the quality or the agreed price. If you had to wait for a regular court session, either you would have to stay at the fair for weeks, or you would have to come back at a later date, or the dispute would simply go unresolved. None of those options is acceptable in a world where trade credit depends on reputation and contracts. So instead, the Court of Pie assembles right there in, or near the fairground. The steward of whoever holds the market charter sits as judge. The merchants themselves, who understand trade law better than any outsider, serve as assessors. The case is heard. Judgment is given within the hour. With the dust of the road still on everyone's feet, I want to step back and offer a perspective here because I think it is genuinely important. Medieval market justice was harsh. Some of it was deeply unjust by any standard. The cucking stool was used disproportionately against women. The pillory could escalate from humiliation to genuine physical danger, and the gap between how a wealthy guild member was treated in court and how a poor itinerant vendor was treated was often significant. None of that should be minimized, and yet I find myself struck repeatedly by something else that runs through all of this. The medieval system of market justice was extraordinarily local. It was conducted in the exact space where the offense occurred by people who were directly part of the community affected, with the offender facing the specific people they had wronged. There was no abstraction in it, no bureaucratic distance, no file sitting in an office somewhere while months passed. A baker who cheated stood in the square where he had cheated. The people who had bought from him were standing around him. They could look directly at him, and he at them. I am not suggesting that public humiliation is a good system of justice. I do not think it is. But I am suggesting that there is something in the directness of it. The insistence that the consequences of wrongdoing be experienced in the same community where the wrongdoing occurred that reflects an understanding of how human accountability actually works. That our more distant, more bureaucratic systems sometimes obscure. The medieval market said, "This is what you did here is where you did it, and here are the people you did it to. Stand here and know that they know." And then, when the time was served and the humiliation complete and the crowd had dispersed back to its business, the market simply continued. The baker was released from the pillory, somewhat reduced in dignity, and walked back to whatever remained of his day. The crowd returned to its transactions. The bell had not stopped the market for justice. Justice had happened within the market alongside everything else. And while all of this was happening, while the court of pea powder was dispensing dusty-footed justice and the pillory stood in the center of the square, and the ale sellers moved through the crowd, something else was also happening in that same market square. Something that tends to get described in the histories as a side note, as a colorful detail, as background noise, but which was in reality one of the most important functions the market performed for the people who depended on it.
It was where they talked.
It was where news traveled, where rumors began, where marriages were arranged and political grievances aired, and relationships made and unmade. The social life of the medieval market was as significant as its commercial life, as its judicial life, as any other dimension of it. And it is that social life, the gossip and the romance, and the political danger of a crowd assembling in one place once a week that we are going to explore next. Cast your mind back to a time before newspapers existed, before the radio, before anything electronic, before the printed word was in every household. Now, ask yourself, how did people learn what was happening in the world? The answer for most of medieval Europe was simple and slightly wonderful. They went to market not to buy anything in particular, not to sell, just to be there, to stand in the middle of the crowd, close enough to hear what the person next to them was saying and to listen. The medieval market was the most powerful information network in the world for its time. That is not an overstatement. In an age without any other mechanism for mass communication, the weekly gathering of hundreds or sometimes thousands of people in a single public space was the primary mechanism through which news, rumor, political opinion, and personal intelligence moved through a community and out into the surrounding countryside. Think about the geography of it. A market town drew people from the villages and farms within walking distance, typically 4 or 5 miles in most directions, as we established at the very beginning of our story. That meant people from 15, 20, 30 different communities, all converging in one square on one day, each of them arriving with the news of their own corner of the world, each of them leaving with whatever they had picked up from everyone else. A man who had spent all week isolated on his farm talking only to his wife. His children, his neighbors, arrived at the market and suddenly had access to people from every village in the district. Some of them had come through the larger town to the south. Some had passed a group of soldiers on the road. Some had heard a priest say something alarming after Mass last Sunday. All of it went into the pot of conversation that the market stirred continuously from the moment the bell rang until the moment it rang again. Historians who study medieval communication have described the market town as something like a node in a network a point where information from many directions gathered, recombined, and dispersed outward again, which is, I think, a slightly bloodless way of describing something that was actually quite vivid and human. A better description might be every market day a town briefly became the most interesting place in its region, and everyone who could get there did. Now, what did they actually talk about? Everything. But some categories deserve particular attention. The first is news about the wider world events happening beyond the immediate community that most people had no other way of learning about. A war going badly in France. A change in the tax rules coming down from the king. A new law about labor that would affect what wages people could demand. A great plague spreading through a neighboring county. These things moved through market conversations with remarkable speed, passing from person to person and town to town along the network of market circuits. Each market day advancing the information another few miles in every direction. And here is where it gets genuinely politically interesting, because the market was one of the very few spaces in medieval society where ordinary people, peasants, craftsmen, traders, women selling eggs could discuss the actions of their rulers without the immediate supervision of those rulers. The market square was public, yes, but it was also noisy and crowded and difficult to police. A conversation happening between two men over a barrel of grain at the far end of the square was essentially unmonitorable by any authority, which meant that opinions which might be dangerous to express elsewhere could circulate fairly freely in the market. The authorities were not oblivious to this. Town records from the medieval period contain cases of people being charged with what was called seditious speech, saying dangerous things about the king or the nobility in public places. And market days appear with significant frequency in these records. Not because the market attracted subversives specifically, but because the market was simply where people talked, and when people talked freely, sometimes the talk turned toward grievance. This brings me to one of the most significant and most dramatic episodes in English medieval history. And I want to look at it through the lens of the market because I think the market connection is underappreciated. The Rising of 1381. What later historians would call the Peasants' Revolt, though that name underestimates both the range of people involved and the seriousness of their demands, did not erupt suddenly from nowhere. It had been building for years through decades of frustration and resentment and rising expectation that the old feudal order could not accommodate. After the Black Death of 1348 had killed between 30 and perhaps 50% of the population, the surviving laborers found themselves in a radically changed position. There were fewer of them. Their labor was more valuable. Lords who needed workers to till their fields could no longer simply command them. They had to offer better terms. For a few brief years, ordinary working people in England experienced something remarkably like leverage. And then the government tried to take it away through a series of statutes of laborers that attempted to freeze wages at their pre-plague levels and restore the old conditions. The resentment this created was real, widespread, and deep. And where did it circulate week after week among people who shared the same frustrations and the same sense of injustice at markets? In the conversations between neighbors, who had all experienced the same thing among the peddlers and traders who moved from town to town and carried the common grievances with them as surely as they carried their goods. Historians who have studied the communications of this period carefully have found evidence of what they describe as organized networks of information and coordination before the Rising of 1381. Letters passed from community to community, some of them remarkably sophisticated documents expressing political philosophy and demands for change. The rebels coordinated their tactics. This level of coordination among people who were supposedly isolated and illiterate was possible in significant part because the market network existed. Because people had been gathering and talking for years. Because the ideas had circulated and the trust had built and the anger had found its shape before anyone picked up a weapon. The rising itself began in Essex and spread with astonishing speed. Within weeks, rebels from Essex and Kent were marching on London, tens of thousands of people, acting in something approaching concert, demanding the abolition of serfdom, the removal of corrupt advisors to the young King Richard II, and a fundamental reordering of English society. They burned the palace of the Duke of Lancaster. They forced open the Tower of London. They very nearly remade the political structure of their country. The revolt was suppressed. Its immediate demands were not met, but the poll tax that had helped trigger it was never tried again. And serfdom in England declined rapidly in the following century. Not because of the revolt directly, but because the economic and social forces the revolt made visible proved impossible to reverse. The market's conversations across years and decades had laid the groundwork for the most significant popular uprising in medieval English history. But it was not all revolution and political conspiracy in those market conversations. Far from it. Most of what the market social life consisted of was considerably more intimate, more personal, and in many ways more revealing of what ordinary medieval life actually felt like from the inside. The market was among other things where you found a spouse, not necessarily through formal arrangement, though formal arrangement certainly happened, but through the more organic process of repeated exposure. A young woman who came to the market every week with her mother's eggs encountered the same young men repeatedly. A young craftsman who sold his work from a stall saw the same faces week after week. Medieval courtship, in its everyday reality, was not the dramatic chivalry romance of the stories. It was this proximity, recognition, gradual familiarity, the slow accumulation of shared encounters in a crowded public space. Contemporary writers occasionally noticed this. There is a thread of mild anxiety in some medieval sources about the market as a place of illicit or potentially improper meeting of young people using the freedom of a crowded public space to have conversations and encounters that their parents might not have sanctioned if they were watching more carefully. Which is when you step back from the moralizing simply a description of what young people have always done with every kind of public gathering available to them. The larger fairs, the great annual events like the Stourbridge Fair near Cambridge, which by the later medieval period had grown into what some called the largest fair in Europe, lasting up to 5 weeks, were even more explicitly social occasions layered on top of their commercial function. People traveled significant distances to attend them, which meant they encountered a genuinely wider range of people than the weekly market provided. Stourbridge drew buyers from Flanders, France, Norway, and across England. A young woman from a small village near Cambridge attending Stourbridge might meet people from a dozen different countries in the course of an afternoon. And then there were the performers. The fairs especially, though some of this spilled into the weekly market as well, attracted musicians, jugglers, storytellers, acrobats, magicians with trained animals, and the extraordinary figure of the traveling entertainer who combined all of these roles in whatever combination drew the most coins. Troubadours sang narrative songs. Gilles performed acrobatics. Minstrels played instruments for dancing. Puppet shows ran at the edges of the fairground. Mystery plays theatrical performances of biblical stories drew large audiences who combined pious attention with genuine enjoyment of the spectacle. The servant hiring fair deserves a particular mention because it was one of the most practically significant social functions of the annual market calendar. At designated times of year, often after the harvest in September, aligned with the agricultural cycle, fairs served as what we might today call a job market in the most literal sense. Servants who had finished a period of employment and were looking for new positions gathered at specific fairs, with symbols of their trade. A shepherd carried a crook, a milkmaid, a pail, a cook displayed a wooden spoon. Employers looking for household or farm staff came to the same fair to find them. Negotiations happened on the spot. Agreements were struck verbally with a handshake and a small payment called earnest money, and a household staff for the next year might be entirely assembled in a single day at the fair. There is something I keep returning to when I think about all of this. The medieval market was in so many ways doing things that we now do through mechanisms that feel utterly different, but serve the same fundamental human needs. We spread news through social media. The market spread it through conversation. We meet potential partners through algorithms that analyze compatibility. The market arranged the same encounters through repeated proximity in a shared space. We consume entertainment through screens in private spaces. The market delivered it live in public as part of a communal experience shared with hundreds of strangers. The technology is unrecognizably different. The human need underneath it for connection, for information, for the sense of being part of a community larger than one's immediate household is identical. And perhaps the thing I find most moving about the social life of the medieval market is precisely this. It was genuinely communal, not curated, not mediated by any algorithm that decided what you should see based on your previous preferences. You came to the market and you encountered whoever else happened to be there. You heard news you had not sought out. You met people you had not expected to meet. The information and the social encounter were inseparable from the physical act of being in a shared space with other human beings, all of whom had their own concerns and their own stories and their own reasons for being there. For people who live their daily lives in relative isolation on farms, in small villages, in households that might go days without significant outside contact, the market day was when they rejoined the human world in its larger form. It was when they remembered week after week that they were part of something bigger than their own corner of the field. The afternoon light is beginning to shift now in the market square. The traders who came from the farthest distances are starting to think about the road home. The sounds of the fair performers are beginning to wind down. Children who were running between the stalls 3 hours ago are tired and leaning against their mothers. Agnes, our woman from the village who walked 4 miles in the dark before dawn to be here, has sold almost everything she brought. The eggs are gone. The herbs are almost gone. One small pot of honey remains. The market is drawing toward its close. But there is one last part of the story. The part that comes after the bell rings for the final time. The part that nobody writes about because it happens in the dark and the quiet. The part about the people who could not afford to buy anything all day and who waited until everyone else had gone. That final hour of the market's day, the hidden world at its edges, is where our story ends. The bell rang, not the opening bell that had summoned everyone in from the dark before dawn. This was the closing bell, 2 separate rings a minute apart, the final signal that the market was done. And London civic records preserved in careful Latin by clerks who documented everything specify that after the second ring all traders were to depart with their wares. Anyone found selling after that second bell faced forfeit of their goods. The market piece was over. The market itself was over. What happened next is the part that almost no one remembers because the people involved left almost no record of themselves. No names in the court rolls, no purchases in the account books, no formal presence in any document that anyone took the trouble to preserve. But they were there. They were always there. Let me tell you about the gleaners. The word itself comes from the agricultural practice of gleaning, the ancient right of the poor to walk through a harvested field after the reapers had finished and collect whatever grain had been dropped or left behind. It is one of the oldest welfare provisions in recorded history, appearing in the Old Testament book of Ruth, where gleaning is explicitly understood as a right of the destitute. You do not own the field. You have no claim on the harvest. But what falls between the reaper's feet belongs to whoever picks it up. The market had its own version of this. When the stalls came down and the traders packed their remaining goods and began the journey home, they left behind what they could not carry and did not consider worth the trouble. A bruised apple that would not survive another day. A small quantity of grain spilled from a torn sack. A piece of cloth too short to sell, but perhaps long enough to patch something. The offcuts, the dropped items, the remnants that had slid under the tables during the busy hours, and waiting for those remnants, having waited with practiced patience at the edges of the square for hours, were the people who could not afford to participate in the market as buyers. Widows, orphan children, the chronically ill who could not work, the very old, the very poor who are always present at every market in every era of human history, and who are always most visible precisely at the moment when everyone else is leaving. Medieval sources almost never describe these people directly. They appear only obliquely in the records of charitable distributions organized by guilds and monasteries, in the occasional legal dispute over who had the right to what was left behind, in the censorious language of preachers who worried about what happened at the market's edges. But they were real. They are the shadow that every market cast, the evidence that the elaborate system of commerce we've been examining all evening was built on foundations that did not extend equally to everyone. There is a passage that has stayed with me since I first encountered it, written by a 14th century Franciscan friar in a handbook for preachers called the Fasciculus Morum, which translates approximately as the bundle of vices. The friar was using the market as a metaphor for the world. And he wrote this: "A marketplace is now filled with people stocked with all sorts of goods, joyful and magnificent. And in a little while everyone goes back to his home, one with profit, another with loss, and the place at once becomes deserted, ugly, dirty, and contemptible. Deserted, ugly, dirty, and contemptible. That is how a 13th century Dominican named Humber de Romans described the market once the trading was over. The contrast was the point the gap between the magnificent spectacle of the full market and the squalid reality of what was left behind. The friar intended it as a moral warning about the transience of worldly things. But reading it 800 years later, I find something else in it, too. The market without the people was nothing. The market was entirely, and only the people. Remove them, and you had some straw on the ground, a few wooden frames, the smell of animals, and discarded food. Add them back, and you had one of the most complex, most layered, most human institutions that medieval civilization produced. As the square emptied in those final minutes, as the traders rolled their carts away, and the catchfuls made their last circuit to ensure the market law had been observed, and the children of the town drifted back to their households, the light was changing. The afternoon sun that had illuminated the full energy of midday was moving toward evening. In the summer months, there would still be hours of light. In winter, the closing bell rang in something close to darkness, and the traders who had furthest to travel began their return journey in the cold. Agnes, our woman from the village, she who had walked 4 miles in the dark before dawn, who had arrived with her basket of eggs and herbs and her one small pot of honey, gathered what remained of her day's work. The eggs were gone. The herbs were almost all sold. The honey she had sold near noon to a woman who examined the pot carefully and then haggled the price down by a half-penny with the cheerful confidence of someone who'd been doing this for 30 years. What Agnes took home was not all goods. Most of it was money in the form of coins, small silver pennies and half-pennies, some of them clipped or worn to the point where their edges were barely visible. She would walk the 4 miles back as the light failed. Not alone. She had neighbors making the same journey, and in winter especially, there was safety and warmth in the company. The road home was quieter than the road and had been the morning energy spent the day's transactions complete. What she carried in her basket was lighter. What she carried in her head was heavier. The conversations, the prices, the news from across the district, the faces of people she had seen, the words exchanged between neighbors that she would remember and think about and pass on in the days before next market day came around. Now, I want to step back from the specific and look at the whole because we have traveled through an entire medieval market day together from 2 o'clock in the morning when farmers were already rising through the bell that opened everything through the commerce and the fraud and the guilds and the spices and the justice and the conversation and the slow close of the afternoon. And I think it deserves one final look as a complete thing. What was the medieval market taken whole? It was a mirror. I've used that word before in the story, and I keep coming back to it because I think it is genuinely the most accurate single word. The market reflected medieval society back at itself with remarkable fidelity. The power dynamics of the guilds, the vulnerability of the poor, the creativity of the fraudsters, and the diligence of the officials who tried to catch them, the hunger for luxury that drove the spice trade across half the world. The human need for news and company and belonging that made the market square the most important public space in any medieval town. The extraordinary interplay of the sacred and the commercial that placed a market cross at the center of every transaction and a court of justice in the middle of the buying and selling. All of it was there. All of it was visible. And the astonishing thing, the thing I genuinely find moving every time I think about it, is that the gap between that world and this one is smaller than it appears. We still have markets where the geography of the stalls encodes social hierarchy. We still have systems of trade where the person who grows the thing gets the smallest portion of its final value. We still have communities where the gossip and the news and the matchmaking happen in the same physical space as the commerce. We still have gleaners at the edges, people who wait for what others leave behind. The forms have changed almost beyond recognition. The human architecture underneath them has not. A 13th century preacher walking through a market in France once observed that in the marketplace, since each man was a devil to himself, just one other demon sufficed, the implication being that human greed and selfishness needed little external encouragement. It is a wonderfully dark observation, and it says something true about human nature that we recognize immediately 800 years later. But I want to offer a counterweight to it because I think the market at its best was also something else. It was where ordinary people, people with almost no formal power, no legal standing, no great wealth, no army gathered in sufficient numbers to be ungovernable. where they talked to each other, where they found out what they shared, where they remembered week after week that they were not alone. The peasants' revolt of 1381 grew in those conversations. The democratic impulse that would eventually reshape English law began in those market squares, not in parliaments, not in the courts of kings, in the space between the stalls where two people standing close enough to smell the same bread reached the same conclusion about the same injustice at the same moment, and turned to find that everyone around them had reached it, too. The medieval market was in the end the most democratic space in a profoundly undemocratic world. Not because everyone was equal within it. They manifestly were not, but because everyone who could walk there was allowed to come to stand in the same square, to breathe the same air, to buy if they had money, and look if they did not. It was a place of genuine commons. And commons in any era are where the human story most honestly tells itself. We began this story before the sun rose with a woman walking alone in the dark toward a market that did not yet exist. 12 parts later, as the bell has rung its second ring and the square empties and the gleaners move quietly through what is left, I hope you feel what I feel, which is that we have spent these hours inside something genuinely alive, not a museum exhibit, not a reconstruction, something that was breathing and arguing and cheating and celebrating and suffering and loving and gossiping in full vivid, unmistakable able reality, and that carries within it more of ourselves than we might expect. The medieval market is over for this week. It will come back as it always does when the bell rings again. Friends, thank you from the very bottom of my heart for spending this long, quiet evening with me inside the daily life of a medieval market. We walked through the darkest hours of the morning together. We navigated the politics of royal charters and the geography of stalls. We met Agnes and her eggs and her honey, the fraudulent baker and his hidden dough, the aloes and the guilds and the journeyman who waited for a door that would not open. We followed a nutmeg from a volcanic island in the Pacific to a stall in a medieval English square. We sat with a quart of pie powder and listened to the conversation that quietly built a revolution. If any part of this story surprised you or moved you, or made you look at the world slightly differently, please leave a comment below. I genuinely read them, and I genuinely love knowing which moment was the one that stayed with you. Was it the baker's dozen? The Venetian Monopoly Agnes, walking 4 miles in the dark?
Tell me.
And if you want more of this, more slow, careful, genuinely researched stories about the world's hiding inside everyday history, then you already know where the subscribe button is. The next story is already forming, and it is going to take us somewhere unexpected. I cannot tell you yet where we're going, but I can promise you this. There are more ordinary people with extraordinary lives waiting to be found, and more history hiding in the details that the textbooks forgot to mention. Until then, rest well. The market has closed, the square is quiet, the gleaners have gone home, and somewhere far away, a bell is already being polished, ready to ring again.